The winter of 1882 descended upon Montana territory like a judgment swift, merciless, and absolute. Snow fell in sheets so thick they erased the boundary between earth and sky, turning the rugged landscape into a realm of ghostly white. In this frozen wilderness, Jackson Thornhill hunted alone. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he crouched to examine the tracks cutting across the pristine snow. He ran his gloved fingers over the impressions his weathered face graved beneath the brim of his worn leather hat. These weren't deer tracks. They were human footprints, small and hurried, sinking deep into the powder. Beside them, larger prints followed with deliberate purpose. Someone was being pursued. Jackson straightened his tall frame, rising like a solitary pine against the backdrop of endless white. At 45, his body still carried the hard-earned strength of a soldier, though 7 years had passed since he'd fought in the war. His beard, once dark as coal, now showed threads of silver, much like the forest around him, where black pines wore mantles of ice and snow. He adjusted his rifle and followed the tracks, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to survive by remaining unnoticed. The wind moaned through the trees, carrying whispers of an approaching storm. He would need to return to his cabin soon, but something about these tracks pulled him forward like an invisible thread. Then he saw it, a splash of crimson against white. Blood on snow. Jackson knelt to examine the stain, still fresh enough to retain its vivid color. A wounded animal would explain the blood, but not the desperate pace of those smaller footprints. He rose, eyes narrowed against the swirling snow, scanning the forest around him. The crack of a gunshot shattered the silence. Jackson instinctively dropped to one knee, his rifle ready. The echo bounced between the mountains, making it difficult to determine the direction. He waited, counting his heartbeats. 3, 4, 5. Another shot rang out closer this time. He moved toward the sound, stepping carefully through the deep snow. His cabin lay 2 miles behind him, a solitary outpost he'd built with his own hands after returning from the war with nothing but nightmares and the knowledge that his wife Catherine was gone, murdered by raiders, while he fought in distant battlefields. The trees thinned ahead, revealing a small clearing. Jackson paused at the edge, scanning carefully before proceeding. Movement caught his eye, a flash of dark cloth against the snow. He raised his rifle, then slowly lowered it as he realized what he was seeing. A child. A small girl huddled behind the trunk of a fallen pine, her dark hair dusted with snowflakes, her thin coat inadequate against the bitter cold. She couldn't be more than 10 years old. As if sensing his presence, she turned, and her eyes widened with a terror that struck Jackson like a physical blow. He set his rifle down deliberately and raised his empty hands. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The girl remained frozen, her gaze darting between him and the trees behind her. Her face was pale with cold, and fierce lips nearly blue. Jackson recognized the look of someone hunted. "Are you alone?" he asked, keeping his distance. She shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. Tears welled in her eyes. "Please," she whispered the word, forming a small cloud between them. "My mama needs help. They hurt her bad." Jackson's chest tightened. The tracks, the blood, the gunshots, they formed a picture he'd seen before, both in war and in the lawless territories where the strong preyed upon the weak. "Where is she?" he asked. The girl pointed with a trembling hand toward a break in the trees. "In the old shed. I ran to find help, but they were coming and I hid." Her voice broke. "Please, hurry. She's so cold." Jackson picked up his rifle and nodded once. "Show me." The girl hesitated only a moment before emerging from her hiding place. Her name was Abigail, she told him as she led the way through the snow, her small boots sinking deep with each step. She glanced back constantly, fear sharpening her features. "Who's after you, Abigail?" Jackson asked, scanning the trees around them. "My Uncle Vernon and his men," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They did awful things to Mama. Cut off all her hair. Said no one would want her now." Jackson's jaw tightened. He'd seen the cruelty men could inflict, especially on those weaker than themselves. It was one of the reasons he'd retreated to this isolated stretch of wilderness after the war, to escape the knowledge of what humans were capable of doing to one another. The abandoned shed appeared ahead, half collapsed under the weight of snow and neglect. It had once been part of a homestead long since abandoned, when the harsh Montana winters proved too brutal for its occupants. "In there," Abigail said, pointing to the sagging doorway. Jackson approached cautiously, listening for any sound of pursuers. "Stay behind me," he instructed, then pushed open the door. Cold air rushed out, carrying the unmistakable metallic scent of blood. The interior was dim, illuminated only by weak light filtering through gaps in the walls. At first, Jackson saw nothing but shadows and the remnants of old farm equipment. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her. A woman lay crumpled against the far wall, as still as death. Her dress was torn and stained dark in places where blood had frozen into the fabric. But what caught Jackson's attention was her head completely shaved, the pale skin marred by cuts and bruises. She looked broken, discarded like something no longer of value. Abigail pushed past him with a cry. "Mama, we found help." The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing a gaze clouded with pain, but still alert. She tried to sit up, but failed, collapsing back with a soft moan. Jackson approached slowly, kneeling beside her. Up close, he could see the extent of her injuries: a split lip, bruised cheekbone, and numerous small cuts on her scalp. Someone had taken their time, making sure she suffered. "Ma'am, I'm Jackson Thornhill," he said quietly. "Your daughter found me. I have a cabin not far from here. We need to get you somewhere warm." Fear flickered across her face. She reached for Abigail with a trembling hand. "Go," she whispered. "Take my girl. Leave me." "I'm not leaving you, Mama," Abigail cried, clutching her mother's hand. "Neither am I," Jackson said firmly. "Can you tell me your name?" The woman's eyes searched his face, looking for deceit or cruelty. Finding neither, she whispered, Eleanor Reed." "Mrs. Reed, I'm going to carry you to my cabin. It's a fair distance, but the storm's coming in fast. We need to move now." As he spoke, the wind outside rose to a howl, driving snow through the gaps in the wooden walls. Eleanor shivered violently, and Jackson saw that her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, the beginning stages of hypothermia. Without waiting for a response, he removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her. Then he lifted her as gently as possible, surprised at how little she weighed. Her body tensed at his touch, but she was too weak to resist. "Abigail, stay close," he instructed the girl, who nodded solemnly. Outside, the snow was falling harder already, beginning to cover their tracks. Jackson set a brisk pace, mindful of the precious burden in his arms and the child struggling to keep up beside him. Each time he looked down at Eleanor's shaved head, something cold and hard settled in his chest, a feeling he'd thought buried with Catherine. Rage. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness as they traveled, occasionally murmuring words he couldn't catch. Abigail trudged beside him in silence, her small face set with determination beyond her years. The gunshots had stopped, but Jackson remained vigilant, aware that the men who had done this might still be searching. The storm would cover their tracks, but it also made the journey more treacherous. By the time his cabin came into view, the snow was nearly knee-deep, and darkness was falling fast. The cabin stood alone against the white landscape smoke, rising from the stone chimney, his morning fire still smoldering. Jackson had built it to last with thick logs and a sturdy roof that could withstand the heaviest snowfall. It wasn't large, but it was solid, a fortress against both weather and intruders. He kicked the door open and carried Eleanor inside, the warmth enveloping them after the bitter cold. The single room was sparse but orderly. A table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves of supplies, and a bed in the corner. Another small door led to a storage room he used for curing meat and storing firewood. Jackson laid Eleanor gently on the bed, Catherine's bed untouched since her death, except for fresh linens he couldn't bring himself to remove. Something twisted inside him at the sight of another woman lying there, but he pushed the feeling aside. There was no time for ghosts. "Abigail, stoke the fire," he instructed, turning his attention to Eleanor. Her breathing was shallow, her skin alarmingly cold to the touch. As Abigail added logs to the embers, Jackson gathered what he needed: clean rags, his medical supplies, and a kettle of water to heat. 7 years of solitude had taught him self-sufficiency, including basic medical skills. During the war, he'd assisted field surgeons often enough to know how to clean and dress wounds. But as he began to remove the coat from Eleanor to assess her injuries, her eyes flew open, filled with terror. Her hand weakly caught his wrist. "Don't," she whispered. "Mrs. Reed, I need to tend your wounds," he explained, keeping his voice steady. "I was a field medic during the war. I know what I'm doing." She shook her head slightly, her gaze darting to Abigail, who was now watching anxiously from beside the fire. Jackson understood. "Abigail," he said, turning to the girl, "I need you to fill the water bucket from the barrel outside. Can you do that?" The child hesitated, reluctant to leave her mother. "It's all right, Abby," Eleanor murmured. "Go help." After Abigail went outside, Jackson spoke softly to Eleanor. "I'll be as quick as I can. I need to see how badly you're hurt." She gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and he proceeded carefully, helping her remove the torn and bloodied dress to reveal a chemise beneath. The fabric was soaked through in places where wounds had bled, adhering to her skin. Her arms and shoulders were mottled with bruises in various stages of healing, evidence that the abuse had been ongoing. Jackson worked methodically, his face betraying none of the anger building inside him. He'd seen injuries like these before during the war, prisoners who had been beaten systematically, day after day. "They enjoyed it," Eleanor whispered suddenly, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Taking their time, making it last." Jackson didn't respond immediately, focusing on cleaning a particularly deep cut on her shoulder. Finally, he said, "Men who hurt women and children aren't men at all. They're cowards." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "My husband's brother and his friends. Family." The door opened as Abigail returned with water. Jackson quickly covered Eleanor with a blanket and took the bucket. "Thank you. Now find something to eat in that cupboard over there. There's dried beef and some hardtack." While Abigail searched for food, Jackson heated water and continued tending to Eleanor's injuries. The worst was a deep gash along her ribs that would need stitches. He explained what he needed to do, and she nodded, her jaw set. "I've had worse," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. As he worked, memories of the battlefield surfaced, the cries of wounded men, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the constant struggle to save those who could be saved and ease the passing of those who couldn't. He had been a teacher before the war, not a doctor, but necessity had made him learn quickly. When he reached the wounds on her scalp, his hands slowed. The shearing had been done brutally, leaving cuts and abrasions across her head. He cleaned each one with gentle precision, noting how Eleanor closed her eyes tightly, tears seeping from beneath her lids. "It grows back," he said quietly, offering the only comfort he could. "They said no man would look at me now," she whispered, "that I was marked as worthless." Jackson's hands paused in their work. "Men who would judge a woman by her hair aren't worth your time, Mrs. Reed." Her eyes opened, studying him with surprise, as if such a simple truth had never occurred to her. As he worked on the final cuts, his fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small, hard edge beneath the fabric of her tattered chemise. Eleanor tensed immediately. "What is it?" he asked, drawing back. "Nothing," she said too quickly. Jackson met her gaze steadily. "Mrs. Reed, if you're hiding something that might put my home at risk, I need to know." After a long moment, she nodded slightly. "Inside the lining, a page from my husband's Bible. It has information. That's why they want it. Why they did this to me." Carefully, Jackson located the small tear in the chemise's lining and extracted a folded piece of paper. It was indeed torn from a Bible, the thin paper bearing verses from the Book of Psalms. But in the margins, written in red ink, was an address in Boston and what appeared to be a coded message. "This is what they're after?" he asked. Eleanor nodded weakly. "My husband left something with a lawyer in Boston. Vernon, his brother, wants it. Thinks it's his by right." "And is it—" A flash of defiance crossed her face. "No, it belongs to Abigail. Harold made sure of that before he died." Jackson refolded the paper and returned it to her. "Then we'll keep it safe." By the time he finished tending her wounds, the storm outside had grown into a full blizzard. Wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters, while snow piled against the walls. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Jackson knew no one would be traveling in such conditions, not even men bent on violence. He finished bandaging Eleanor's wounds and helped her into one of his clean shirts, which hung like a tent on her thin frame. Throughout it all, she remained stoic, only the occasional sharp intake of breath betraying her pain. Abigail had fallen asleep by the fire, exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. Jackson carefully lifted the child and placed her on the bearskin rug near the hearth, covering her with a woolen blanket. Then he turned back to Eleanor. "You need rest," he said. "Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Eleanor's eyes were already closing her body, surrendering to exhaustion now that she was warm and her wounds were tended. "Why are you helping us?" she murmured, the question barely audible. Jackson stared into the flames for a long moment. "Because 7 years ago, no one helped my wife when she needed it. I wasn't there to protect her. But I'm here now." He wasn't sure if Eleanor heard him. Her breathing had deepened into sleep, her body finally yielding to the safety of the moment. Jackson added more logs to the fire, then settled into his chair rifle across his lap. The storm would keep her pursuers at bay for now, but they would come. Men like that always did. As the night deepened, Jackson watched over the sleeping figures, the woman with her shorn head, and the child curled beside the fire. For the first time in 7 years, his cabin held something besides memories and regrets. It held lives that depended on him. He rose silently and moved to a shelf near the fireplace. From behind a row of books, unusual possessions for a frontier cabin, he retrieved a small wooden box. Inside lay a folded piece of cloth, which he carefully unwrapped to reveal a special blanket, with intricate patterns woven in deep blues and reds. The blanket had been a gift from a Blackfoot healer who had saved Jackson's life after a battle. "It holds medicine," the old man had told him, "not for the body, but for the spirit." Jackson had kept it all these years, though he'd never used it himself. His spirit, he believed, was beyond healing. but now he carried it to the bed and gently laid it over Eleanor, tucking it around her shoulders. As he did so, he noticed Abigail watching him through half-open eyes. "What's that?" she asked sleepily. "A healing blanket," he answered simply. "It will help your mama get strong again." Abigail reached out to touch the colorful weaving. "It's pretty." "It is," he agreed. "Now sleep. You're safe here." The child nodded and closed her eyes, apparently satisfied with his answer. Jackson returned to his chair, watching as the storm battered the world outside, while 3 broken souls sheltered within the cabin's walls. Eleanor woke to pain and unfamiliar surroundings. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was back in the shed, or worse, returned to Vernon's house. Then she felt the softness beneath her, and the warmth of the blanket covering her, a blanket unlike any she'd seen, with patterns that seemed to tell a story in thread and color. Sunlight streamed through a small window, illuminating a cabin that was both foreign and somehow welcoming. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee. She tried to sit up, but gasped as pain shot through her ribs. "Careful," a deep voice cautioned. "Those stitches need time." Eleanor turned to see Jackson Thornhill standing by a cast-iron stove, his tall frame slightly stooped in the confines of the cabin. In daylight, she could see him clearly for the first time, the weathered face framed by a dark beard flecked with gray eyes, the color of gunmetal, watchful and measuring. He looked like what he was, a man who had seen too much of the world's harshness. "Abigail," she asked, her voice cracking with dryness. "Outside, feeding the chickens." He poured water into a cup and brought it to her. "She's a brave girl. Reminds me of someone I used to know." Eleanor accepted the water gratefully, noting how he was careful not to touch her hand as he passed the cup. "Thank you," she said after drinking. "For everything." Jackson nodded once, then returned to the stove. "Blizzard's passed, but there's 3 feet of snow out there. No one's traveling for a few days at least." Relief washed over her. A few days of safety seemed an impossible luxury after months of constant fear. "Are you hungry?" he asked, stirring something in a pot. Eleanor realized she was starving. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal. At Vernon's house, she'd been lucky to get scraps from the kitchen. "Yes," she admitted. He brought her a bowl of stew, simple fare, but the rich smell made her mouth water. As she ate, she studied the cabin. It was small, but surprisingly comfortable, with shelves of books along one wall, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and a neat stack of firewood beside the hearth. Everything had its place, suggesting a man accustomed to order. But what caught her attention was a small framed photograph on a shelf above the fireplace. A woman with dark hair and a gentle smile standing beside a younger version of Jackson, the only personal item in an otherwise utilitarian space. "Your wife?" she asked, nodding toward the photograph. A shadow crossed Jackson's face. "Yes, Catherine. She's beautiful." "She was," he agreed, his tone making it clear he didn't wish to discuss her further. Eleanor turned her attention back to the stew, understanding all too well the pain of lost love. Her own husband, Harold, had been dead just over a year, taken by pneumonia after a winter journey. Unlike Catherine, there were no photographs to remember him by. Vernon had destroyed them all, claiming they were his property as head of the family. The door burst open and Abigail rushed in, her cheeks flushed with cold. "Mama, you're awake!" She ran to the bed and threw her arms around Eleanor, who winced but returned the embrace fiercely. "Careful of your mother's wounds," Jackson cautioned, but his voice held no real reproach. Abigail loosened her grip but remained pressed against Eleanor's side. "Mr. Thornhill has chickens, Mama, and a horse in the barn. and he showed me where the stream is under the ice." Eleanor smiled at her daughter's excitement. It had been so long since she'd seen Abigail this animated. At Vernon's house, the child had learned to make herself invisible to speak only when spoken to. "Did you thank Mr. Thornhill for showing you these things?" she asked. Abigail nodded earnestly. "Yes, ma'am. And I helped feed the animals like he showed me." Jackson moved about the cabin, putting things in order, with efficient movements. "She's a good helper," he said, glancing at Abigail. "Quick to learn." Pride warmed Eleanor's chest. She always has been. The morning passed in quiet activity. Jackson tended to chores outside while Eleanor rested her body, demanding sleep, as it began the process of healing. Abigail alternated between helping Jackson and sitting beside her mother, chattering about the cabin and its surroundings. By afternoon, Eleanor felt strong enough to sit up properly, though her ribs protested every movement. She found a small mirror on a shelf and hesitantly lifted it to examine herself. The face that looked back was a stranger's pale gaunt, with dark circles beneath her eyes, and her scalp a landscape of small cuts and bruises where hair had been roughly shorn away. Vernon had known exactly what he was doing when he ordered her head shaved. In the small religious community where they lived, a woman's hair was her glory. To be shorn was to be marked as fallen immoral. No respectable person would help her after that. A soft noise made her look up. Jackson stood in the doorway, snow melting from his boots, watching her with an unreadable expression. "It looks worse than it is," she said, setting the mirror down. "I've seen worse," he replied simply. "Men who lost limbs, skin burned away. Hair grows back. The rest heals too, given time." His matter-of-fact tone was oddly comforting. There was no pity in it, no disgust, just the practical assessment of someone who understood that bodies could be broken and mended. "Vernon didn't think so," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "He said I'd be marked forever, that everyone would know what I was." Jackson removed his coat and hung it by the door. "And what are you, Mrs. Reed, that deserves such treatment?" The question caught her off guard. What was she? A widow? A mother? A woman who had once taught music to children in St. Louis before marrying Harold and moving west. A woman who had failed to provide the Reed family with a male heir. "A disappointment," she said finally, the word bitter on her tongue. Jackson crossed to the fireplace and added a log, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "That's not an answer," he said, his back to her. "That's what someone else decided you were." Before she could respond, Abigail emerged from the small storage room where she'd been exploring with Jackson's permission. "Mama, look what I found." She held up an old book, its leather cover worn smooth with age. "Mr. Thornhill has lots of books. More than the schoolhouse back home." Eleanor glanced at Jackson in surprise. Books were uncommon in frontier cabins where practical concerns usually outweighed literary ones. "I was a teacher," he said, answering her unspoken question. "Before the war." This revelation shifted something in Eleanor's perception of him. She had assumed he was like most men in these territories, perhaps a trapper, or a failed prospector, someone who valued strength over knowledge. The idea that he had once stood before a classroom imparting wisdom to children seemed at odds with the solitary figure who had carried her through the snow. "What did you teach?" she asked. "History, literature, whatever the town needed." He shrugged, as if dismissing that part of his life. "It was a long time ago." Abigail opened the book, running her fingers over the pages. "Can I read it?" "If you'd like," Jackson replied. "It's The Last of the Mohicans. Not an easy read, but a good story." "I can read hard books," Abigail declared proudly. "Mama taught me." She was a teacher, too, before we came to live with Uncle Vernon. Jackson's eyebrows rose slightly as he glanced at Eleanor. Is that so? Eleanor nodded. I taught piano mostly, but reading and arithmetic too when needed. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Teachers seem to wash up in strange places out here. For the first time since their arrival, the atmosphere in the cabin lightened. Abigail settled by the fire with the book, while Jackson prepared a simple dinner of salt pork and beans. Eleanor watched them, struck by how quickly her daughter had adapted to this strange man and his isolated home. Children were resilient in ways adults could not match. As darkness fell once more, the temperature dropped sharply. Jackson built up the fire and placed extra blankets on the bearskin rug where Abigail would sleep. The cold snap's setting in, he explained. It'll be 15 below by morning. Eleanor thought of the shed where he'd found them, of how close they had come to freezing to death. A shiver ran through her that had nothing to do with the current temperature. We would have died there, she said quietly, when Abigail was out of earshot, having gone to use the outhouse before bed. Jackson paused in his preparations. Yes, you would have. Why did you help us truly? She pressed. You could have left us. Many would have. He turned to face her, his expression grave. During the war, I saw men walk past the suffering of others because it wasn't their concern. I swore I wouldn't become that kind of man. He paused. And when Catherine died, it was because no one stopped to help when raiders came through our valley. I was away fighting, and our neighbors decided it wasn't their problem. The pain in his voice was raw even after 7 years. Eleanor understood then that helping them wasn't just an act of kindness, it was atonement for a past he couldn't change. I'm sorry about your wife, she said softly. He nodded once, accepting her sympathy without comment. Then, and as if the conversation had become too personal, he returned to his tasks, checking the security of the windows and door before settling into his chair by the fire. That night, as the wind howled outside and the temperature plummeted, Eleanor lay awake beneath the colorful blanket, listening to Jackson's steady breathing from his place by the hearth. Abigail slept soundly on her rug, exhaustion overcoming the strangeness of their situation. Eleanor's thoughts turned to the piece of paper hidden in her clothes, the page that Vernon would kill to possess. Harold had known his brother's true nature, even if he'd never spoken of it openly. In his final days as pneumonia ravaged his lungs, he had torn a page from his Bible and written instructions for Eleanor how to find the lawyer in Boston, how to secure Abigail's inheritance. Vernon will try to take everything, Harold had whispered, his breath rattling. He's always been greedy. But what's mine is Abigail's. I've made sure of it. Eleanor had promised to follow his instructions, but after Harold's death, Vernon had moved quickly, bringing them to live in his house under the guise of family duty. At first he had been almost kind, if distant. Then the questions about Harold's affairs had begun growing more insistent with each passing day. When she refused to reveal what she knew, the abuse started subtle at first, then increasingly open. By the time she realized the danger they were in, it was too late. Vernon had confiscated their belongings, destroyed their identification papers, and effectively imprisoned them in his home. Their escape had been desperate and ill-planned, made possible only because one of Vernon's servants, a young girl who had witnessed Eleanor's mistreatment, left a door unlocked during the night. Now, lying in a stranger's bed, Eleanor wondered if they had merely traded one danger for another. Jackson Thornhill had been kind, but she had learned the hard way that men's kindness could vanish like morning mist. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the healing blanket he had placed over her. It smelled of herbs and smoke, foreign yet comforting. For now at least, they were safe. The storm would keep Vernon away, and Jackson seemed capable of handling trouble when it came. And it would come. Of that, Eleanor had no doubt. Jackson woke before dawn, as was his habit. The cabin was silent, except for the soft breathing of his guests and the occasional pop from the banked fire. He rose quietly, added logs to the embers, and prepared for the day ahead. The thermometer outside the window confirmed his prediction, 15 degrees below zero, with more cold to come. No one would be traveling in such conditions, but that didn't mean they could afford complacency. Vernon Reed would be searching for his sister-in-law and niece as soon as the weather permitted. Jackson needed to prepare. He dressed warmly and slipped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold hit like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in his beard. The snow around the cabin had drifted nearly to the windowsills, transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. In the barn, his horse nickered softly in greeting. Jackson fed and watered the animal, then checked his small flock of chickens. Survival on the frontier required planning and redundancy, multiple sources of food, water, and heat. His years alone had taught him to leave nothing to chance. As he worked, his mind turned over the problem of Eleanor and Abigail Reed. The smart course would be to send them on their way once the weather cleared, point them toward the nearest town, and wash his hands of their troubles. Getting involved in a family dispute, especially one that had already turned violent, was asking for complications he didn't need. But the image of Eleanor's shaved head and battered body kept returning to him. The way Vernon Reed had marked her, intending to make her an outcast that no one would help. The way Abigail had looked at him with absolute trust when he'd covered her with a blanket. They had nowhere else to go. Jackson finished his chores and returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots before entering. Eleanor was awake, sitting up in bed, with the colorful healing blanket wrapped around her shoulders. In the soft light of early morning, with her face clean and her eyes clear, he could see traces of the woman she must have been before Vernon Reed's cruelty, proud, intelligent, dignified, despite her circumstances. "You're up early," she observed. "Force of habit," he replied, moving to the stove to heat water for coffee. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Still sore, but better." She touched her ribs gingerly. "You do good work, Mr. Thornhill." "Jackson," he corrected. "If you're staying in my home, you might as well use my name." She nodded, accepting this small shift in formality. "Jackson, then, and I'm Eleanor." The use of his given name felt strange after so long. Few people had called him Jackson since Catherine died. In town, on his rare visits, he was simply Thornhill, or the Widow Man, or sometimes that strange fellow who lives up by Broken Fir Creek. "Are you hungry?" he asked, changing the subject. "Yes, but I can help." Eleanor made a move to rise, but he shook his head. "Rest today. Tomorrow's soon enough to start moving around." She settled back, though he could tell it frustrated her to be idle. "At least let me do something. I'm not used to sitting still." Jackson considered, then gestured to a pile of mending on a shelf. "If you're determined, there's some sewing needs doing. I'm not much hand with a needle." Relief crossed her face at the prospect of being useful. "I can manage that." And he brought her the mending shirts with torn seams, socks with holes along with his sewing kit. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Eleanor tensed momentarily before accepting the items. "Thank you," she said, already sorting through the work. Jackson nodded and turned away, giving her space. He understood her wariness all too well. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford to give freely. Abigail woke as the sun rose fully, her eyes widening briefly in confusion before she remembered where she was. "Good morning, Mr. Thornhill," she said, sitting up and rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Good morning, Mama." "Morning, child," Jackson replied. "Breakfast's nearly ready." The day settled into a quiet rhythm. Jackson took Abigail outside briefly to gather more firewood, teaching her which logs burned hottest and how to spot the dry ones beneath the snow. The girl was an eager student, asking questions about everything from the tracks they found around the cabin to the way the smoke rose straight up in the frigid air. "You know a lot," she observed as they carried armloads of wood back to the cabin. "I've had time to learn," Jackson replied. "Because you live all alone." He glanced down at her curious face. "Yes." "Don't you get lonely?" The question, innocent and direct, caught him off guard. Did he get lonely? Of course he did. But loneliness was preferable to the alternative, the risk of caring for people who could be taken away, as Catherine had been. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but being alone has its advantages too." Abigail considered this seriously. "Like what?" "Well, I don't have to share my breakfast, and no one complains if I don't sweep the floor." A smile broke across her face. "That's not a very good reason to be alone." Despite himself, Jackson felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Perhaps you're right." Inside, Eleanor had made progress on the mending her stitches neat and precise. She looked up as they entered, her eyes immediately checking Abigail for any sign of distress. "We brought lots of wood, Mama," Abigail announced. "And I saw rabbit tracks." "Did you now?" Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face despite the bruises. "Perhaps Mr. Thornhill will teach you about tracking." "If the weather holds, I'll need to check my trap line tomorrow," Jackson said. "You can come along if your mother doesn't mind." Abigail turned to Eleanor with pleading eyes. "Can I? Mama, please." Eleanor hesitated, her instinct to protect her daughter, warring with the knowledge that they were safer with Jackson than anywhere else. "If Mr. Thornhill doesn't mind the company," she said finally. "I don't mind," he assured her. "It's good for her to learn these things." As the day progressed, Jackson noticed Eleanor watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, studying his movements, his habits, the way he interacted with Abigail. He recognized the calculation behind her observation. She was trying to determine what kind of man he was, whether they were truly safe with him. It was a reasonable precaution. In her position, he would do the same. Evening came early, as it always did in winter. Jackson prepared a simple meal of cornbread and venison stew, setting portions aside for the next day. Eleanor insisted on helping this time, moving carefully to the table to slice the bread while he stirred the pot. "You cook better than most bachelors I've known," she commented. "Necessity," he explained. "It was either learn or eat poorly." "Did your wife teach you?" "Some," he acknowledged. "Catherine was a fine cook, but I've had 7 years to practice on my own." Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Harold couldn't boil water without burning it. I did all the cooking." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "He tried once to surprise me on my birthday, nearly burned down the kitchen." It was the first time she'd spoken of her husband with anything but sadness. Jackson found himself curious about the man who had earned her love and loyalty. "How long were you married?" he asked. 6 years, she replied. "We met in St. Louis, where I was teaching. Harold was there on business. He sold farm equipment. He was so different from other men who came courting. Gentle, respectful." Her voice softened. "He asked what books I liked to read before he asked if I could cook." Jackson could imagine it, a young Eleanor, with a full head of hair, perhaps seated at a piano, catching the eye of a traveling salesman who recognized her worth beyond her domestic abilities. "Vernon is nothing like him," she continued, her tone hardening. "Brothers by blood only. Where Harold built things, Vernon destroys. Where Harold gave, Vernon takes. Yet Harold left his brother in charge of his affairs, Jackson observed. Eleanor's hands stilled on the bread knife. No, that's what Vernon claimed, but it wasn't true. Harold left everything to Abigail with me as trustee until she comes of age. Her voice dropped to ensure Abigail, reading by the fire, couldn't hear. That's what the paper is about. Directions to find Harold's will, the real one, not the forgery Vernon presented after the funeral. Jackson absorbed this information silently. A disputed inheritance explained much about Vernon's pursuit. There was money involved, perhaps significant amounts. Men had killed for far less. "This lawyer in Boston," he said quietly. "He has the will." Eleanor nodded. "And other papers. Proof that Vernon has been embezzling from the company for years. Harold discovered it just before he died." The stakes were higher than Jackson had realized. Vernon Reed wasn't just after an inheritance, he was trying to cover up crimes that could send him to prison. "He'll keep coming," Jackson said, stating the obvious. "Yes." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I understand if you want us to leave once the weather clears. We've brought enough trouble to your door." Jackson considered his response carefully. The sensible answer was yes, they should move on, take their problems elsewhere. But the thought of sending them out into the winter with Vernon Reed hunting them turned his stomach. "We'll discuss it when the time comes," he said finally. "For now, you're not going anywhere in this cold." Relief flickered in Eleanor's eyes, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you." After dinner, while Abigail continued reading her book, Jackson retrieved his journal from a shelf and sat at the table. It was his nightly ritual, recording the day's events, the weather, any significant observations about the land and its creatures. In a life of solitude, the journal had become both record and companion, a way of marking his existence in a world that had largely forgotten him. Eleanor watched him curiously from her place on the bed. "You keep a journal, habit from teaching days," he explained without looking up. "Makes you pay attention to things you might otherwise miss." "Like what?" He considered the question. "Like how the juniper berries are more plentiful this winter than last. Like how the creek ice froze in patterns that look like fern leaves. Small things." "Important things," she corrected gently. Jackson glanced up, surprised by her understanding. Most people would consider his observations trivial, the musings of a lonely man with too much time on his hands. But Eleanor seemed to grasp their significance, that in noticing the details of the natural world, he maintained a connection to life itself. "Yes," he agreed. "Important things." Later, as the fire burned low and Abigail slept soundly on her bearskin rug, Jackson heard Eleanor stirring restlessly in the bed. He turned from his position in the chair to find her sitting up, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the darkness. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. She startled slightly, then relaxed when she saw him watching. "Bad dreams," she admitted. "They come most nights now." Jackson nodded, familiar with nightmares that refused to fade with time. "Want to talk about them?" "No," she paused. "But thank you for offering." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of wind outside. "Do they ever go away?" Eleanor asked finally. "The dreams," Jackson considered lying, offering the comfort of false hope. But she deserved honesty. "Not entirely. They change, though, become less frequent, less powerful." "I dream of Vernon finding us," she confessed. "Of what he'll do to Abigail if he catches us." He won't," Jackson said with quiet certainty. "You can't know that." "I can promise to do everything in my power to prevent it," he countered. "And I keep my promises, Eleanor." She studied him in the dim light, weighing his words. "I believe you do." she said finally, and lay back down, pulling the healing blanket close around her shoulders. Jackson remained awake long after her breathing had deepened into sleep. He stared into the dying embers, thinking of promises, those kept and those broken. He had promised Catherine he would return from the war. He had kept that promise, but too late to save her. Now he had made another promise to a woman he barely knew. But this time, he had the power to keep it. Vernon Reed and his men might come, but they would not find Jackson Thornhill unprepared. Outside, the wind died suddenly, leaving an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch snapping under the weight of ice. The storm had passed, and with its passing, the countdown began. Soon, the snow would settle enough for travel, and the world would find its way to his door once more. Jackson added another log to the fire and settled back in his chair rifle within easy reach. He would be ready when it did. The next 3 days passed in a pattern that grew increasingly familiar. Jackson rose before dawn to tend to the animals and check the perimeter of his property for any sign of intruders. Eleanor gained strength daily, moving around the cabin with more confidence, while Abigail shadowed Jackson during his chores, absorbing knowledge about survival in the harsh Montana winter. On the 4th morning, Jackson woke from a fitful sleep to the sound of screaming. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, before recognizing the cries, as his own voice echoing off the cabin walls. The nightmare, always the same one, had returned, Catherine calling his name as flames consumed their home, the raiders laughing as they rode away, his desperate race through the woods arriving too late. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with concern. Abigail had pressed herself into a corner, frightened by his sudden violence. "I'm sorry," Jackson said, setting the rifle down carefully. "Bad dream." Eleanor nodded understanding in her gaze. "It's all right. We all have them." He moved to the door, needing air, needing space from the suffocating weight of memory. Outside, the world was transformed. The temperature had risen overnight, and a gentle thaw had begun dripping from the eaves in a steady rhythm. The snow remained deep, but its crust had softened. Jackson filled his lungs with the crisp morning air, forcing his heartbeat to slow. It had been weeks since the last nightmare, and he'd foolishly hoped they were fading at last. But perhaps having others in his space, in Catherine's space, had stirred the ghosts he'd tried so hard to put to rest. The door opened behind him, and he turned to find Eleanor standing there wrapped in his coat. She moved carefully, her injuries still healing, but with more strength than he'd expected. "You should be resting," he said. "I've rested enough." She joined him on the porch, maintaining a respectful distance. "The war?" He understood she was asking about his nightmare. "Partly. The aftermath more so." Eleanor nodded, not pressing for details he wasn't ready to give. Instead, she looked out at the softening landscape. "The thaw's coming early." "Yes." Jackson didn't elaborate on what they both knew, that the improved weather meant travel would soon be possible, for them and for Vernon Reed. They stood in silence for a moment, breath forming clouds in the morning air. "Abigail has taken to you," Eleanor said finally. "She talks about you constantly when you're outside. Mr. Thornhill knows how to track rabbits. Mr. Thornhill can tell when a storm is coming just by smelling the air." Despite himself, Jackson felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising temperature. "She's a bright child, observant, like her father." Eleanor's voice held both fondness and sorrow. "Harold noticed things others missed. It made him a good salesman. He could read people, understand what they needed before they knew themselves." "And you?" Jackson asked. "What did he see in you?" Eleanor seemed surprised by the question. I'm not sure, she admitted. I asked him once. He said he liked how I closed my eyes when I played the piano, like I was hearing something no one else could. The image was vivid, Eleanor at a piano, lost in music, Harold watching with growing admiration. It spoke of a genuine connection, a true partnership. He sounds like a good man, Jackson said. He was. Eleanor pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. Vernon was jealous of him. Always has been. Harold was the younger brother, but he was more successful, better liked. Her mouth tightened. After Harold died, Vernon told everyone how he'd step in, take care of his brother's widow and child. He played the role of the benevolent patriarch perfectly. Until you were behind closed doors, Jackson guessed. Eleanor nodded. At first it was small things, forgetting, to give me mail restricting my access to funds Harold had left. Then he began spreading rumors that I was unstable with grief, that I needed supervision. By the time I realized what was happening, we were prisoners in all but name. Why didn't you run sooner? I tried once. She touched her scalp unconsciously. That's when this happened. Vernon said if I tried again it would be Abigail who suffered. I believed him. Jackson's jaw tightened. What changed? I overheard him talking to his men. They were planning to have me committed to an asylum, declare me insane and unfit to care for Abigail. They would have separated us permanently. Her eyes hardened. I decided I'd rather die trying to escape than live without my daughter. The door opened again and Abigail peered out cautiously. Seeing that the adults were calm, she stepped onto the porch. Mama, are you all right? Her voice was small, still uncertain after Jackson's violent awakening. I'm fine, sweetheart. Eleanor held out an arm and Abigail pressed against her side. Mr. Thornhill had a bad dream, that's all. Like the ones you sometimes have. Abigail looked up at Jackson with newfound understanding. About scary things that happened before. Yes, he said simply. About scary things that happened before. The child nodded solemnly. I have those too. About Uncle Vernon. Jackson and Eleanor exchanged a glance over Abigail's head. The girl had witnessed more than either of them had realized. Well, Jackson said, deliberately lightening his tone, bad dreams can't hurt us in the daylight. And we have work to do. He gestured toward the softening snow. Weather like this, we should check the trap line. Want to come along? Abigail's face brightened. Can I, Mama? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Stay close to Mr. Thornhill and do exactly as he says. I will. The girl was already bouncing with excitement. Let's eat first, Jackson suggested, ushering them back inside. It's a fair distance to the traps. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of Jackson's molasses, he and Abigail prepared for their expedition. Jackson helped the girl bundle up in one of his old shirts, cut down to serve as an extra layer beneath her coat. He showed her how to wrap strips of hide around her boots for better traction in the snow. We'll be back before midday, he told Eleanor, who was clearly anxious about their departure, despite her agreement. Stay inside. Keep the door barred. She nodded, handing Abigail a knitted scarf to wrap around her face. Be careful, both of you. Outside, the day had warmed further, the snow turning soft and wet. Jackson set a deliberate pace, keeping to areas where the snow had been packed down by his previous passages. Abigail followed in his footsteps, her face serious with concentration. How far are your traps? She asked, as they crossed a small clearing. About a mile out in different directions, he replied. We'll check the closest ones today. Have you always been a trapper? Jackson glanced down at her curious face. No, I've been many things. Like what? A soldier, a teacher before that. Abigail's eyes widened. A real teacher, with a schoolhouse and everything. Yes, in a small town in Pennsylvania before the war. What did you teach the children? Reading, writing, history. Jackson smiled slightly at the memory. Shakespeare when the school board wasn't looking. What's Shakespeare? A man who wrote plays stories that actors perform on stage. He lived a long time ago in England. Abigail considered this new information. Did you like being a teacher? I did, Jackson admitted. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to remember that time, the satisfaction of watching young minds expand the simple joy of sharing knowledge. Why did you stop? The question innocent as it was brought back darker memories, the outbreak of war, the call for volunteers, the patriotic fervor that had swept through his town. He had enlisted, believing it would be over quickly, that he would return to his classroom within months. The war came, he said simply. Everything changed. Abigail nodded, accepting this explanation with the wisdom of a child who had seen her own world upended by forces beyond her control. They reached the first trap set near a frozen stream where animals came to drink from holes in the ice. It was empty, the bait taken, but the mechanism unsprung. Clever fox, Jackson murmured, resetting it with fresh bait from his pack. See how the tracks go around the trap. He's learned to be careful. Abigail knelt to examine the footprints in the snow. Will he come back? Probably. Animals are creatures of habit. Jackson pointed to other tracks nearby. Look here. What do you see? The girl studied the impressions. They're different, bigger. Good eye. Those are wolf tracks. Wolves hunt the same areas foxes do, following similar game trails. Are there wolves near your cabin? Abigail asked, a hint of fear in her voice. Sometimes, but they avoid humans when they can. They're not the monsters stories make them out to be. They moved on to the next trap, which held a snowshoe hare, its white fur stained red where the trap had caught it. Abigail's eyes widened at the sight. Is it dead? She whispered. Yes, Jackson confirmed, kneeling to remove the animal from the trap. It was quick, better than being taken by a predator. It's so pretty, Abigail said sadly. I didn't know you killed things. Jackson paused, hearing the genuine distress in her voice. I only take what I need to survive, he explained. The fur keeps me warm. The meat feeds me through winter. He met her troubled gaze. Out here, everything is connected. Everything lives and dies as part of the same cycle. Like Papa, she said unexpectedly. He died, and now we're here with you. The simple truth of her observation struck Jackson deeply. Yes, Harold Reed's death had set in motion a chain of events that brought his family to Jackson's door, changing all their lives. That's right, he said softly. Everything is connected. They checked 2 more traps, finding one empty and one with a marten, its sleek brown body limp in death. Jackson demonstrated how to properly retrieve the animals without damaging the valuable fur, explaining each step to Abigail, who watched with solemn attention. As they turned back toward the cabin, Jackson noticed the girl was quieter than before, her earlier enthusiasm dampened by the reality of trapping. It bothers you, he observed. The animals. Abigail nodded reluctantly. Mama says God made all creatures, and we should respect them. Your mother is right. Jackson adjusted his pack, the weight of the trapped animals a familiar burden. Respect doesn't mean we can't use what nature provides. It means we don't take more than we need, and we honor what we take by using it well. The child considered this, her small face thoughtful. Did the Indians teach you that? Jackson looked at her in surprise. What makes you ask about Indians? The blanket you gave Mama. It has Indian patterns, and you have that medicine bag hanging by the door. He had underestimated her powers of observation. The medicine bag, a small leather pouch filled with herbs and small tokens, had been another gift from the Blackfoot healer. "Yes," he acknowledged, "I learned much from the Blackfoot people. After the war, I was lost. They helped me find my way again." "Were you sick?" "In a way." Jackson wasn't sure how to explain to a child the darkness that had consumed him after Catherine's death, the rage, the guilt, the emptiness that had driven him to the brink of ending his own life. "My spirit was sick. A Blackfoot medicine man helped heal it." Abigail nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Like the blanket is healing Mama." "Something like that." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the sound of melting snow dripping from branches the only interruption. Jackson found himself impressed by the child's resilience, her ability to absorb new experiences, to ask difficult questions, to adapt to circumstances that would overwhelm many adults. "Your father would be proud of you," he said suddenly. Abigail looked up startled. "Really?" "Yes, you're brave and smart. Those are good qualities." A small smile lit her face. "Papa used to say I was brave. Uncle Vernon said girls shouldn't be brave, that we should be obedient instead." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Your uncle was wrong about many things." As they neared the cabin, Jackson felt a prickle of unease. Something was different. He stopped, holding up a hand to signal Abigail to do the same. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Jackson scanned the area carefully, his eyes picking out details most would miss. A branch snapped in a way melting snow wouldn't cause a disturbance in the pattern of drips from the eaves. "Someone's been here," he said quietly. Fear flashed across Abigail's face. "Uncle Vernon, I don't know. Stay behind me." They approached the cabin cautiously. The door was still closed, the windows intact. No smoke rose from the chimney, which was concerning. Eleanor should have maintained the fire in their absence. Jackson set down his pack and drew his rifle, motioning for Abigail to remain hidden behind a woodpile. He circled the cabin once, checking for tracks, and found them on the north side, a single set of boot prints, large and deep, leading to and from the trees. The prints were partially filled with melted snow, indicating they'd been made at least an hour ago. Whoever had visited was likely gone, but Jackson took no chances. He approached the door carefully, noting that the bar was still in place from the inside. "Eleanor," he called. "It's Jackson and Abigail." No response came. Jackson's unease deepened. He signaled Abigail to stay put, then knocked firmly on the door. "Eleanor, if you can hear me, open the door." After a moment that stretched like eternity, he heard movement inside. The bar scraped as it was removed, and the door opened slowly to reveal Eleanor, her face pale but composed. "You're back," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Come inside quickly." Jackson ushered Abigail in ahead of him, then closed and barred the door. The cabin was cold, the fire having died down to embers. Eleanor immediately moved to stoke it, her hands shaking slightly. "What happened?" Jackson asked, setting his rifle aside, but keeping it within reach. Eleanor glanced at Abigail, who was watching with wide, frightened eyes. "Abby, would you put more wood on the fire? Mr. Thornhill and I need to talk." The child nodded and busied herself with the task, though Jackson could tell she was straining to hear their conversation. Eleanor led him to the far corner of the cabin and spoke in a low voice. "Someone was watching the cabin. I saw him through the window, just a shape at the edge of the trees. He was there for nearly an hour, then left." "Did you recognize him?" She shook her head. "He stayed too far away." "But it has to be one of Vernon's men." "Why didn't you keep the fire going?" Jackson asked, concerned by how cold the cabin had become. "I was afraid the smoke would confirm someone was here." She rubbed her arms, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. I thought it was better to let the fire die down. Jackson nodded, acknowledging her logic. You did right, but we need to warm up now. He moved to help Abigail with the fire, adding larger logs once the smaller pieces caught. As warmth slowly returned to the cabin, Jackson considered their situation. The thaw meant Vernon's men could now travel, and at least one scout had already found his cabin. It was only a matter of time before they came in force. We should leave, Eleanor said, reading his thoughts. Tonight, under cover of darkness. And go where? Jackson asked. The nearest town is 30 miles south. You're not strong enough for that journey yet. We have no choice. They'll come, and they'll hurt you to get to us. Her voice caught. I won't have another death on my conscience. Jackson studied her face, seeing the guilt and fear warring there. This isn't your fault, Eleanor. Vernon is the one who chose violence. But we brought it to your door. I opened that door willingly. Jackson moved to the window, checking the tree line where the observer had stood. Besides, running now would be dangerous. If they're watching, they'll follow. Better to face them here where we have shelter and supplies. Eleanor's shoulders slumped in defeat. Then what do we do? Jackson turned back to her, his decision made. We prepare, and we send for help. Help who would help us out here. I have a friend in Clearwater, Frank Sullivan, the sheriff there. He was my sergeant during the war. If I can get word to him, he'll come. Hope flickered in Eleanor's eyes. How? We can't leave, and there's no one to carry a message. There's a way station 10 miles east of here. The mail carrier stops there every week on Thursdays. Jackson checked the calendar he kept near his journal. That's tomorrow. 10 miles in this snow, you'd never make it back before dark. I have to try. Jackson began gathering supplies, extra ammunition, dried meat, a small flask of whiskey. I'll leave at first light, reach the station by noon, and be back before nightfall. Eleanor watched him, doubt clear on her face. And if Vernon's men come while you're gone, bar the door. Use this. Jackson removed a revolver from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, checking that it was loaded before handing it to her. Do you know how to use it? Eleanor took the weapon with surprising confidence. Harold taught me. He said a woman alone should know how to protect herself. Smart man. Jackson continued his preparations, aware of Abigail watching them from beside the now roaring fire. I'll show you where to hide if they come a root cellar beneath the storage room. It's small, but it will conceal you both if necessary. As night fell, Jackson completed his preparations for the journey. He showed Eleanor and Abigail the hidden cellar, accessible through a trapdoor concealed beneath shelving in the storage room. He stocked it with blankets, water, and food enough to last several days if needed. Only use it as a last resort, he instructed. It gets cold down there, and there's limited air. Dinner was a subdued affair, the weight of impending danger hanging over them. Abigail sensed the tension, though she didn't fully understand its cause. She stuck close to Eleanor, her earlier enthusiasm for exploration dampened by fear. After the meal, as Jackson checked his gear one final time, Eleanor approached him by the door. I have something for you, she said, holding out a folded piece of cloth. It's not much, but it might help. Jackson took it, unfolding the fabric to reveal a carefully sewn inner pocket sized to hold the Bible page with its precious information. I noticed you have an inside pocket in your coat, she explained. This will make it more secure. The paper is safer with you than with me, especially if something happens while you're gone. The implications of her gift were clear. She was entrusting him with their future, with the evidence that could free them from Vernon's pursuit. Nothing will happen, Jackson said firmly. But thank you. He carefully transferred the Bible page to its new hiding place, then secured it inside his coat. Later, as Eleanor and Abigail slept, Jackson remained awake, watching the darkness beyond the windows. The thaw had continued throughout the day, and a light fog now hung over the landscape, shrouding the trees in ghostly white. In that mist, enemies could approach unseen, but it would also cover his departure in the morning, providing a measure of protection as he set out for the way station. Jackson leaned back in his chair rifle across his lap and prepared for another night of watchfulness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now, his duty was to guard the sleeping figures who had, against all odds, come to depend on him. In the silence of the cabin, with only the occasional pop from the fire to break the stillness, Jackson found himself remembering Catherine's words from long ago. "We're put on this earth to help each other through the hard times, Jack. That's the only thing that really matters." He had failed her. But perhaps, in protecting Eleanor and Abigail, he could begin to make amends. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, its cry echoing across the valley. Another answered from closer by the sound haunting and beautiful in its wildness. Jackson listened, finding a strange comfort in their voices, creatures surviving, despite the harshness of their world, finding strength in their pack. He had been alone too long. Perhaps it was time to remember what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. Dawn broke with reluctant fingers of pale light stretching across the snow-laden valley. Jackson stood on the cabin porch, testing the air. The temperature hovered just above freezing, warm enough to keep the snow soft and wet, making travel slow and exhausting. But there was no choice. The mail carrier would be at the way station today, and this might be their only chance to summon help. Behind him, Eleanor emerged from the cabin, Abigail's scarf clutched in her hands. "Take this," she said, offering it to him. "For luck." Jackson accepted the worn wool garment, noting the careful darning where it had been repaired. "I'll bring it back," he promised, tucking it inside his coat. Eleanor's eyes held a mixture of hope and fear. "Be careful. Vernon's men won't hesitate to shoot if they see you." "I know these woods better than they do." Jackson checked his rifle one last time, then slung it across his back. "Remember what I told you, bar the door, keep the revolver close, and use the cellar if necessary." "We will." She hesitated, then added, "Come back safely, Jackson." The simple words carried a weight that settled in his chest, a reminder that he was no longer responsible only for himself. People depended on him now. He nodded once, then turned and set off his long strides, carrying him quickly into the shelter of the trees. The forest was eerily quiet in the morning mist, the usual sounds of birds and small creatures muted by the lingering fog. Jackson moved with practiced stealth, avoiding the obvious trails where someone might lie in wait. The way station lay due east, a small outpost maintained by the territorial government for mail carriers and the occasional traveler. It wasn't much, just a rough cabin with basic supplies, but it represented their best hope for summoning aid. As he walked, Jackson's thoughts turned to Eleanor and Abigail. In less than a week, they had transformed his solitary existence, bringing both danger and an unexpected sense of purpose. He had forgotten what it felt like to be needed, to have someone waiting for his return. The sensation was both comforting and terrifying. The fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, revealing a landscape in the midst of change. Water dripped from tree branches, and patches of bare ground had begun to appear where the snow had melted away. Spring was making an early bid for dominance, though winter would not surrender its grip so easily. By tonight, the temperature would plummet again, freezing the meltwater into treacherous sheets of ice. Jackson maintained a steady pace, alert for any sign of Vernon's men. The scouting presence yesterday suggested they were close, perhaps camped within a few miles of the cabin. It was a race now. If he could reach the way station and send for Frank before Vernon mounted his attack, they might stand a chance. By mid-morning, Jackson had covered nearly 5 miles, the exertion warming him despite the damp chill that hung in the air. He paused at the crest of a small ridge, using the vantage point to scan his surroundings. The valley stretched below him, a patchwork of white snow and dark evergreens. Nothing moved except the occasional fall of snow from overloaded branches. He was about to continue when a glint of light caught his eye, sunlight reflecting off something metallic in the distance. Jackson dropped to one knee, eyes narrowed as he focused on the source. There, nearly a mile away near the base of the opposing ridge, was a thin column of smoke rising from among the trees, a campfire poorly concealed. Jackson retrieved his small spyglass from his pack, extending it to study the distant camp. The magnification revealed what he feared: horses tethered among the pines, and the movements of at least 3 men. At this distance, he couldn't make out their features, but their presence alone was confirmation. Vernon's men had established a base from which to launch their attack. The question was, how many were there in total? The scout from yesterday might be among them, or he could be elsewhere, perhaps tracking Jackson at this very moment. Jackson pocketed the spyglass and considered his options. He could continue to the way station as planned, but doing so would take him dangerously close to the enemy camp. Alternatively, he could return to warn Eleanor, but that would mean abandoning their best chance for reinforcements. A third option presented itself. He could approach the camp, assess their numbers and readiness, and perhaps gain valuable intelligence about their plans. It was risky, but knowledge of the enemy might prove crucial in the coming confrontation. Decision made, Jackson altered his course, moving parallel to the ridge to maintain the high ground while drawing closer to the camp. He advanced with extreme caution, placing each foot deliberately to avoid snapping twigs or disturbing the melting snow. As he neared the camp, voices carried on the still air, men talking unaware of his presence. Jackson crouched behind the broad trunk of a fallen pine, close enough now to observe without being seen. He counted 4 men, all armed, gathered around a small fire. Their horses, 5 in total, suggested at least one more man was unaccounted for, likely the scout. Jackson studied each face carefully, committing them to memory. None was Vernon Reed, at least not based on Eleanor's description of a tall, broad-shouldered man with a prominent scar across one cheek. "Should have hit the cabin at first light," one of the men was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet forest. "Reed's gonna be furious when he gets here and finds out we've been sitting on our hands." "And what would you have us do, Matthews?" another replied. "There's a man in there with a rifle in case you forgot. Jeffers said he saw him leave with the girl yesterday checking traps. You want to end up shot because you were impatient." "I'm saying Reed's paying us good money to get the woman and the kid, not to sit around and with our thumbs up our asses. Reed said wait for him, so we wait." This came from a third man, older than the others, with a gray beard and an air of authority. "He'll be here by nightfall, and then we move. Until then, we stick to the plan. Watch the cabin, track their movements, but don't engage." Jackson's blood ran cold. Vernon Reed would arrive tonight, and then they would attack in force. There was even less time than he'd thought. He was about to retreat when a twig snapped behind him. Jackson froze, every muscle tensing as he sensed rather than saw someone approaching from his rear. "Found something interesting, boys," a voice called out far too close. Jackson dove to his left as a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the log where he had been crouched just moments before. He rolled to his feet, rifle already swinging toward the threat, a bearded man in a heavy coat now frantically trying to reload his pistol. There was no time for hesitation. Jackson fired, the rifle's report echoing across the valley as the scout staggered backward, clutching his chest. He fell without a sound, his body crumpling into the snow. Shouts erupted from the camp below as the other men grabbed their weapons. Jackson turned and ran, using the trees for cover, as bullets whizzed past him. He had the advantage of higher ground and better knowledge of the terrain, but they had numbers. He sprinted through the forest, changing direction frequently to confuse pursuers, his breath coming in controlled bursts. The plan for the way station was now impossible. He needed to return to the cabin immediately and prepare for the coming attack. Behind him, he could hear the men crashing through the underbrush, calling to each other as they spread out in pursuit. Jackson slowed only long enough to reload his rifle, then continued his strategic retreat, gradually angling back toward his cabin, while maintaining enough distance to avoid leading them directly to Eleanor and Abigail. For over an hour he played a deadly game of cat and mouse among the trees, sometimes doubling back to confuse his trail, other times moving through small streams where the water had broken through the ice, leaving no footprints to follow. Gradually, the sounds of pursuit faded, though Jackson knew they hadn't given up. They had simply fallen too far behind to maintain contact. By early afternoon, he approached his cabin from the north, circling wide to ensure he hadn't been followed. The small clearing appeared undisturbed, with smoke rising steadily from the chimney. He studied the surroundings carefully before emerging from the tree line, alert for any sign of ambush. "Eleanor," he called softly as he reached the porch. "It's Jackson." The door opened immediately, revealing Eleanor with the revolver held ready. Relief washed over her face when she saw him. "You're back early," she said quickly, ushering him inside and barring the door. "What happened? You're bleeding." Jackson touched his cheek, surprised to find a streak of blood where a branch had caught him during his flight. "They're closer than we thought, camped about 6 miles from here." Abigail rushed forward from her place by the fire. "Did they hurt you? Did they shoot at you?" Jackson knelt to her level, his expression gentle, despite the urgency of their situation. "I'm fine. Just a scratch from running through the trees." He rose, turning to Eleanor. "Vernon will be joining his men tonight. They plan to attack after he arrives." Eleanor paled, her hand tightening on the revolver. "How many?" "I counted 4 in the camp, plus a scout." Jackson's jaw tightened. "The scout won't be a problem anymore, but that still leaves 4 men plus Vernon when he arrives." "You killed him," Eleanor stated, not a question but a realization. Jackson met her gaze steadily. "He shot at me first. I did what was necessary." She nodded once, accepting his answer without judgment. "What now?" "We can't reach your friend, the sheriff. We prepare." Jackson moved to the storage room, retrieving boxes of ammunition and additional weapons, a shotgun, and an old army revolver. "Vernon and his men will come tonight or tomorrow at the latest. We need to be ready." As Jackson laid out his strategy, Abigail sat quietly by the fire, her small face solemn as she listened to the adults discuss the coming violence. Eleanor noticed her daughter's distress and sent her to sort through the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a task that would keep her occupied while they spoke. "Vernon won't be easily deterred," Eleanor warned, her voice low. "He's obsessed with finding that will, and he hates losing. He always has since he was a boy, according to Harold." "Men like that are predictable," Jackson replied, checking the action on the shotgun. "They mistake cruelty for strength. It makes them careless. Not Vernon. He's calculating. That's what makes him dangerous." Eleanor hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. Something I haven't told you." Jackson paused in his preparations, giving her his full attention. "Abigail isn't my daughter by blood," she said softly, glancing to ensure the girl couldn't hear. "She's my sister's child. Lily died in childbirth, and I took Abigail as my own. Harold knew he loved her like his own daughter, but Vernon discovered the truth after Harold's death. He found my sister's letters. Why does that matter to Vernon? Jackson asked. Because Harold's will specifies that his estate goes to his beloved daughter, Abigail. If Abigail isn't his biological child, Vernon could contest the will, claim the inheritance for himself as Harold's only living blood relative. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. That's why he's so determined to find us. The paper you're carrying doesn't just lead to Harold's real will, it leads to adoption papers Harold filed in Boston, legally making Abigail his daughter in every sense. Without those papers, Vernon could win in court. The revelation added another layer to the conflict, not just a matter of controlling an inheritance, but of erasing a dead man's wishes for his chosen daughter. It made Vernon's pursuit even more comprehensible and more despicable. "Does Abigail know?" Jackson asked. Eleanor shook her head. "I've never told her. I planned to when she was older, but then Harold died and everything fell apart." Her eyes filled with tears. "She's my daughter, in every way that matters. I've raised her since she was a newborn." "She is your daughter," Jackson agreed firmly, "and this doesn't change anything about our situation. We still need to hold Vernon off until help can arrive." They spent the remainder of the daylight hours preparing the cabin for defense. Jackson showed Eleanor how to reload the revolver quickly and where to position herself for maximum protection. He moved furniture to create additional barriers and filled buckets with water in case fire became a threat. Outside, he set simple alarms cans containing small stones hung from nearly invisible threads stretched across likely approaches. The noise would alert them to anyone approaching in the darkness. As dusk approached, Jackson took Abigail aside for a private conversation, while Eleanor prepared a meal from their dwindling supplies. "I have an important job for you," he told the girl, his tone serious but kind. "If bad men come tonight, you need to help your mother get to the cellar. Can you do that?" Abigail nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir." "Good. And once you're there, you need to stay quiet no matter what you hear, like a mouse hiding from a cat. Can you be that quiet?" "I can," she promised. "But what about you? Aren't you coming to hide too?" Jackson smiled gently. "My job is to make sure you and your mother are safe. I'll join you when I can." The child seemed to understand the implicit meaning that he might not join them at all. Her small hand reached out to touch his arm. "Please be careful, Mr. Thornhill. I don't want you to get hurt because of us." The simple sincerity of her concern touched something deep within Jackson, a place he'd thought long since walled off. "I'll be careful," he promised. "Now go help your mother with dinner. We need to keep up our strength." They ate in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Jackson maintained a watchful eye on the windows, though he knew Vernon was unlikely to arrive before full dark. Eleanor moved with a nervous energy, repeatedly checking that the revolver was within easy reach. As they cleared away the meal, Jackson noted that Abigail had barely touched her food. "You need to eat," he told her gently, "to keep up your strength." "I'm not hungry," she replied, her voice small. Eleanor knelt beside her daughter. "Abby, sweetheart, I know you're scared, but Mr. Thornhill is right. You need to eat something." The girl looked between them, her eyes welling with tears. "Are we going to die?" The blunt question hung in the air. Jackson and Eleanor exchanged a glance, wordless communication passing between them. "No," Jackson said firmly. "We are not going to die. I won't let that happen." "But the bad men have guns," Abigail persisted, "and there are more of them than us." "Numbers aren't everything," Jackson told her, sitting down so they were eye to eye. "I have something they don't have." "What's that?" Something worth fighting for. He looked at Eleanor as he said it, and something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. Eleanor's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't look away. Abby, remember what I told you about David and Goliath? Sometimes the smaller fighter wins, because they're smarter or braver or because they're on the side of what's right. Abigail nodded slowly, then picked up her spoon and took a small bite of the stew. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As full darkness settled over the cabin, Jackson extinguished all lamps except one small candle burning in the back room away from the windows. The darkness would preserve their night vision and make it harder for attackers to pinpoint their positions inside. "Try to rest," he told Eleanor and Abigail. "I'll keep watch. If anything happens, I'll wake you immediately." Eleanor helped Abigail settle on the bearskin rug by the fire, wrapping her in blankets, and singing softly until the child's eyes grew heavy with sleep. Then she joined Jackson by the window, her face ghostly in the faint light reflecting off the snow outside. "You should rest too," he said quietly. "I couldn't sleep if I tried." She stared out at the dark landscape. "It's strange. I've been afraid for so long that it almost feels normal now. But this is different. Tonight it ends one way or another." Jackson understood. The anticipation of violence carried its own peculiar tension, a state of heightened awareness that was both exhausting and impossible to relinquish. "If we don't survive this," Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We will," Jackson interrupted. "But if we don't," she persisted, "I want you to know that these days in your cabin have been the first time I've felt safe since Harold died. You've shown Abigail and me a kindness we had forgotten existed." She turned to face him fully. "Whatever happens, I want to thank you for that." Jackson felt uncomfortable under the weight of her gratitude. "You would have done the same for me," he said simply. "Would I?" Eleanor's lips curved in a sad smile. "I'm not so sure. Fear makes cowards of most people. I've seen it, neighbors who looked the other way when Vernon paraded me through town with my head shaved. Friends who closed their doors rather than risk his displeasure. That's their shame to carry, not yours." Perhaps. She gazed out at the night again. "What will you do, Jackson? After this is over, I mean." The question caught him off guard. He had been so focused on their immediate survival that he hadn't considered what would come after. For 7 years his life had followed the same solitary pattern, hunting, trapping, existing, rather than living. The idea of a future beyond that seemed almost impossible to contemplate. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Nor have I," Eleanor said softly. "But I find myself wanting to for the first time in a long while." Before Jackson could respond, a metallic rattling shattered the silence, one of his alarm cans triggered by movement at the edge of the clearing. "They're here," he said, instantly alert. "Wake Abigail. Get ready to move to the cellar, if I give the word." Eleanor nodded, her momentary vulnerability replaced by determined focus as she moved to rouse her daughter. Jackson positioned himself by the window, rifle ready, watching for movement in the darkness. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The night remained still, with only the occasional gust of wind disturbing the branches of the nearby pines. Then Jackson caught a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from the tree line, followed by another. They were being cautious, approaching from multiple directions, using the trees for cover. Jackson counted 3 figures moving through the darkness, which meant at least 2 others were positioned elsewhere, possibly circling to the rear of the cabin. The crack of a rifle shot confirmed his suspicion. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from his head, fired from behind the cabin. Jackson ducked down, motioning for Eleanor to stay low. "Thornhill," a voice called from the darkness. We know you're in there. Send out the woman and the girl, and we'll let you live." Jackson didn't respond, knowing that engaging would only help them pinpoint his position. Instead, he moved silently to another window, watching as the shadows drew closer to the cabin. "Last chance, Thornhill," the voice called again. "Reed's offering $50 for you to walk away. That's good money for a few minutes' work." When Jackson remained silent, a new barrage of gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. Eleanor clutched Abigail close, both huddled behind an overturned table for protection. Jackson waited for a pause in the shooting, then fired twice in rapid succession. A cry of pain told him at least one shot had found its mark. The attackers fell back, retreating to the cover of the trees. "You hit," one of them called. "Grazed my arm," came the reply. "Bastard can shoot, I'll give him that." Jackson used the reprieve to move to Eleanor and Abigail. "They're testing our defenses," he explained quietly, "trying to draw us out, or get us to waste ammunition. They'll try something else soon." As if on cue, a flaming arrow arced through the air, landing on the cabin roof with a soft thud. A second and third followed their fiery trails, illuminating the night. "Fire!" Eleanor gasped. "They're trying to burn us out." Jackson grabbed the water buckets he'd prepared earlier. "The roof's still wet from the thaw. It won't catch easily, but we need to be ready." A fourth arrow struck the porch, the flames catching on the wooden planks. Jackson flung open the door just long enough to douse the fire bullets, kicking up splinters around his feet as he did so. "Eleanor," he said urgently as he closed the door again, "take Abigail to the cellar now. They'll keep trying to burn the cabin. It's not safe up here." She hesitated clearly, torn between obeying and staying to help. "What about you? I'll hold them off as long as I can. Frank checks the way station every Thursday. When he doesn't find me there, he'll come looking. We just need to last until then. And if the cabin burns around you—" Jackson's expression was grim. "I'll retreat to the cellar before that happens. Now go, please." Eleanor gathered Abigail in her arms. "Remember your promise," she said fiercely. "You said we wouldn't die tonight." "And I meant it," he replied. "Go." As Eleanor led Abigail to the storage room and the hidden cellar beneath, Jackson returned to the window. The fire arrows had illuminated the attackers' positions, giving him a momentary advantage. He spotted a figure moving between trees and fired. The man dropped through, whether dead or merely wounded, Jackson couldn't tell. More arrows came, most missing the cabin entirely in the attackers' haste. Those that landed on the roof sizzled in the dampness before going out. But Jackson knew it was only a matter of time before something caught. The wood would eventually dry from the heat, becoming more susceptible to the flames. A new voice called from the darkness, different from the one before, deeper, more authoritative. "Thornhill, this is Vernon Reed. I know you have my sister-in-law and niece in there. They don't belong to you." So Reed had arrived just as his men had predicted. Jackson remained silent, conserving ammunition and refusing to reveal his position. "I'm a reasonable man, Thornhill," Reed continued. "I understand Eleanor may have poisoned your mind against me with her lies. She's unwell, has been since my dear brother's death. All I want is to take her home, get her the care she needs." The lies were smooth, practiced, the words of a man accustomed to manipulating others. Jackson wondered how many people had believed Reed's concerned act, how many had turned a blind eye to his cruelty, because he presented such a reasonable facade. "The girl needs a proper family, a proper upbringing," Reed called. "Surely you can see that a child shouldn't be raised in a situation like this, trapped in a cabin, with a stranger, a man with no ties to her. What would people think?" When Jackson still didn't respond, Reed's tone hardened. "Have it your way. But know this, that cabin will burn with or without you in it, and I will take what's mine." A new volley of fire arrows followed, more concentrated this time, one lodged in the eave of the cabin, the flames catching in the dry wood beneath the roofline. Jackson cursed under his breath. He would need to extinguish it quickly, but doing so meant exposing himself to gunfire. There was no choice. He grabbed a bucket of water and a long pole he kept by the door for knocking snow from the roof. Taking a deep breath, he flung open the door and used the pole to dislodge the burning arrow, then doused the flames with water. Bullets whizzed around him, one grazing his arm in a line of fire. Jackson slammed the door shut and pressed his back against it, breathing hard. The wound wasn't serious, just a deep scratch that bled freely, but it confirmed what he already knew. Reed and his men were tightening the noose, and his options were dwindling. He reloaded his rifle, ignoring the burning in his arm. Outside, the attackers were growing bolder, moving closer to the cabin under the cover of darkness. Jackson counted at least 4 distinct figures now, including a tall man who could only be Vernon Reed. A crash from the rear of the cabin drew his attention. They were trying to break in through the storage room window. Jackson moved swiftly, firing through the small window before anyone could climb through. A howl of pain rewarded his vigilance. "Matthews is hit bad," someone shouted. "Reed, this is getting too costly." "Shut up and press forward." Reed's voice was cold with fury. "There's one of him, and 5 of us. I want that cabin taken now." Jackson checked his ammunition. He had perhaps 20 rounds left for the rifle, 12 for the shotgun, and 6 each in the revolvers. It would have to be enough. The attack intensified with gunfire from multiple directions, keeping Jackson pinned down, while others attempted to set the cabin ablaze. He moved from window to window, firing when he had a clear shot, conserving bullets when he didn't. Another arrow found purchase in the roof, and this time the flames spread slowly along the dry wood of the eave. Smoke began to fill the cabin, acrid and choking. Jackson pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth, but his eyes stung and watered. He needed to get to the cellar soon before the smoke overcame him. A sudden crash signaled a new threat. Someone had thrown a burning branch through one of the windows, sending glass and flames onto the cabin floor. Jackson stamped out the fire, but in doing so, left himself exposed. A bullet tore through his leg, the impact spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. Pain exploded through his thigh, hot and immediate. Jackson gritted his teeth against the cry that threatened to escape. He couldn't show weakness, not now. Using the wall for support, he dragged himself back to his feet, ignoring the blood soaking his trousers. The smoke was thicker now, making it difficult to see. The roof was burning in earnest small flames visible through cracks in the ceiling. Jackson knew he had minutes at most before the entire structure became a death trap. It was time to retreat to the cellar. Gathering the remaining ammunition and a canteen of water, Jackson limped toward the storage room. Every step sent waves of agony through his injured leg, but he forced himself forward. He had promised Eleanor and Abigail they would survive this night, and he intended to keep that promise. The storage room was hazy with smoke, but cooler than the main cabin. Jackson shifted the shelving unit that concealed the trap door, his injured leg nearly buckling under the strain. He lifted the heavy wooden door and lowered himself awkwardly into the darkness below. "Eleanor," he called softly. "It's Jackson." "Here," came her immediate response. A match flared, illuminating her face in the small space. She gasped when she saw him. "You're hurt." "Not badly," he lied, closing the trapdoor above them. "The cabin's burning. We need to stay down here until it's safe to leave. The cellar was little more than a dugout beneath the cabin, a space about 8 feet square, reinforced with timber supports, and lined with shelves holding preserved food and supplies. The ceiling was low, forcing Jackson to hunch uncomfortably as Eleanor helped him to a rough bench along one wall. Abigail was huddled in the corner, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes widened at the sight of Jackson's blood-soaked trousers. "You got shot," she said, her voice small with fear. "Just a scratch," Jackson assured her, though the throbbing pain suggested otherwise. "Nothing to worry about." Eleanor lit a small oil lamp, keeping the flame low to conserve air. In its dim light, she examined Jackson's leg. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his thigh, missing the bone, but leaving a nasty wound that continued to bleed steadily. "This needs to be bandaged," she said, tearing strips from the hem of her dress. "Abby, bring me the water canteen and that small medicine bag from the shelf." As Abigail hurried to obey, Eleanor worked quickly to clean and bind the wound. Above them, they could hear the fire consuming the cabin, the crack and groan of burning timbers, the occasional crash as a section of roof collapsed. "They think we're still inside," Jackson said, wincing as Eleanor tightened the bandage. "That gives us an advantage." "What advantage?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with tension. "We're trapped under a burning building and you're wounded. But they don't know about this cellar. Once they believe we're dead, they'll leave. Then we can escape through the tunnel." Eleanor paused in her ministrations. "What tunnel?" Jackson managed a grim smile despite the pain. "Did you think I'd build a hiding place without an exit?" He nodded toward the darkest corner of the cellar. "Behind those barrels. It leads out to the stream bank about 50 yards from the cabin. I dug it after Catherine died, wanted to make sure I always had a way out if raiders came again." Relief flooded Eleanor's face. "So we can escape while they're watching the cabin burn." "Once they believe we're dead, yes. But we need to be patient. Reed won't leave until he's certain." As if to confirm his words, Vernon Reed's voice carried to them faintly through the burning structure above. "Keep watching. Make sure none of them escape. I want to see bodies when this is over." Eleanor shuddered at the hatred in that voice. "He won't stop, will he? Even if he thinks we're dead, he'll search the ashes." "Probably," Jackson agreed. "But by then, we'll be long gone." He shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position for his injured leg. "There's a small cave about 2 miles downstream. We can shelter there until it's safe to move on." Abigail had been listening silently, her eyes moving between the adults. Now she spoke, her voice surprisingly steady. "What about your friend the sheriff? Won't he come to help us?" "He will," Jackson assured her. "But it might take a day or two. We need to stay hidden until then." The cellar grew warmer as the fire intensified above them, the heat seeping through the earthen ceiling despite the layer of insulation Jackson had installed. Sweat beaded on their faces, but the alternative, opening the trap door, would mean certain death from smoke inhalation. Time stretched endlessly in the close confines of the cellar. Abigail eventually fell into an uneasy sleep, her head resting against Eleanor's shoulder. Eleanor remained awake, her attention divided between the sleeping child and Jackson, whose face had grown pale with pain and blood loss. "How bad is it really?" she asked softly, nodding toward his leg. "I've had worse," Jackson replied, though the wound was beginning to throb alarmingly, and he suspected infection would set in if it wasn't properly treated soon. "I'll make it to the cave." Eleanor's eyes held doubt, but she didn't contradict him. "Tell me about this cave. Is it safe?" "Safe enough. Dry, hidden from view. I've used it before when hunting trips ran longer than expected." Jackson shifted again, trying to ease the pressure on his injury. "There's a natural spring inside, and I keep some emergency supplies there." You think of everything, Eleanor observed. Not everything. I didn't foresee Vernon Reed. Jackson's mouth twisted in a grimace that might have been a smile under different circumstances. But I've learned to prepare for the unexpected. Above them, the sounds of the fire had changed less crackling, more the hollow groaning of a structure in its death throes. Occasionally, they heard voices as Reed's men called to each other, but the words were indistinct. "They're still watching," Jackson said, "waiting for us to try to escape the flames. How long will they wait?" "Until morning, probably. Reed won't leave until he's certain." Jackson checked the chamber of his revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded. "But we don't need to wait that long. Once the main structure collapses, they'll assume we're dead, and we can slip away through the tunnel." Eleanor nodded, her arm tightening protectively around Abigail. "And then what? Where do we go from here?" The question hung between them, laden with implications beyond their immediate survival. Jackson found himself without a ready answer. For 7 years he had lived day to day, expecting nothing beyond the next sunrise. The idea of planning a future, of considering what came after, was foreign territory. "First we survive," he said finally. "Then we find Frank and deal with Reed. After that—" He paused, studying Eleanor's face in the dim light. "After that, I suppose you'll want to go to Boston to find that lawyer and secure Abigail's inheritance." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "But what about you?" Before Jackson could respond, a tremendous crash shook the cellar as a major portion of the cabin collapsed above them. Dust and debris sifted through cracks in the ceiling, and Abigail woke with a startled cry. "It's all right," Eleanor soothed, hugging her daughter close. "We're safe down here." Jackson listened intently. The collapse had been followed by shouts of triumph from Reed's men. They believed their objective had been achieved. "The cabin's gone," a voice called. "Nothing could have survived that." "Search the ruins," came Reed's reply, closer now. "I want to see their bodies." "Are you crazy? That place is still an inferno." "We'll check in the morning when it's cooled down." A pause, then Reed's reluctant agreement. "Fine, but we camp here tonight. No one leaves until I've seen proof they're dead." Jackson met Eleanor's gaze across the dim cellar. "Now we wait," he said quietly. "Let them settle in for the night. Then we make our move." Hours passed in tense silence. The heat gradually dissipated as the fire burned itself out, leaving the cellar in darkness when they extinguished the lamp to conserve oil. Jackson fought against the pain and weakness in his leg, knowing that the coming escape would demand every ounce of his remaining strength. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, when the voices above had fallen silent except for the murmur of a single watchman, Jackson decided it was time. "Eleanor," he whispered, touching her arm gently. "Wake up. It's time to go." She stirred immediately, having only dozed lightly. "Now." "Yes, they've posted one guard. The others are sleeping. This is our best chance." Jackson shifted to the corner of the cellar, wincing as his injured leg protested the movement. "Help me with these barrels." Together, they moved the heavy water barrels that concealed the entrance to the escape tunnel. Behind them was a narrow opening barely large enough for an adult to crawl through on hands and knees. "Abigail goes first," Jackson instructed. "Then you, then me. The tunnel is about 30 yards long, and it comes out under a fallen log near the stream. Once you're out, stay hidden until I join you." Eleanor woke Abigail, gently explaining in hushed tones what they needed to do. The child, still half asleep, nodded her understanding. "Like a secret passage in a castle," she whispered. "Exactly like that," Jackson agreed, grateful for her resilience. Can you be brave and lead the way? Abigail nodded solemnly. I can be brave. Jackson showed her the entrance, explaining how to navigate the narrow space. Follow the tunnel until you see light. It's very dark, but there's only one way to go, so you can't get lost. With a last determined look at her mother, Abigail crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from view. Eleanor followed moments later, casting a worried glance at Jackson, before she too vanished into the darkness. Alone in the cellar, Jackson gathered their few remaining supplies: the revolver's ammunition, a canteen of water, and a small bundle of food. Moving was agony, his wounded leg stiff and throbbing. The bandage Eleanor had applied was soaked through with fresh blood, but there was no time to change it now. With a deep breath, Jackson lowered himself into the tunnel entrance, dragging his injured leg behind him. The space was even tighter than he remembered, the earthen walls pressing in on all sides as he crawled forward on elbows and one good knee. Progress was slow and painful. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his leg, and the exertion soon had him sweating despite the cool air in the tunnel. But he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Eleanor and Abigail were waiting for him, depending on him to guide them to safety. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching before him in absolute darkness. Had it always been this long, Jackson fought against the disorientation, focusing on moving forward, inch by agonizing inch. Finally, he saw it, a faint lightening in the darkness ahead. The exit was near. With renewed determination, Jackson crawled the final yards, emerging at last beneath the hollow of a fallen pine log, just as he'd described. Eleanor was waiting, her face tight with worry. "You made it," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. "I was about to come back for you." "I told you I would," Jackson replied, though his voice was strained with pain. "Where's Abigail?" "Here," came a small voice from behind a nearby tree. The girl peeked out, then rushed to Jackson's side when she saw him emerge. "Are you all right? You took so long." "Just moving carefully," he assured her, not wanting to worry her with the truth that his strength was failing rapidly and the wound in his leg was far worse than he'd let on. Eleanor helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as best she could. "Which way to the cave?" she asked. Jackson oriented himself, noting the position of the stars visible through breaks in the clouds. "Downstream. Follow the creek east for about 2 miles. There's a stand of 3 large boulders on the north bank. The cave entrance is behind them, hidden by brush." They moved cautiously through the forest, staying close to the stream, but keeping to the shadows of the trees. Above and behind them, the remains of the cabin glowed with lingering embers, casting an eerie red light over the clearing. A solitary figure, the watchman, was visible, pacing near what had been the front porch. "He hasn't noticed we're gone," Eleanor whispered. "They really believe we died in the fire." "Let's keep it that way," Jackson responded. "Move quietly and stay low." The journey to the cave was grueling. Jackson's injured leg threatened to give out with each step, and only Eleanor's support kept him moving forward. Abigail walked ahead of them, scouting the path, as Jackson had taught her, her small form almost ghostly in the pre-dawn light. By the time they reached the 3 boulders Jackson had described, the eastern sky had begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Jackson was feverish, his face slick with sweat despite the cold air. "Here," he managed, indicating a dense growth of brush against the rock face. "Behind there." Eleanor pushed aside the branches, revealing a narrow opening little more than a crack in the stone, but wide enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. "Abigail, you first," she directed. "Then we'll help Mr. Thornhill." The cave beyond the entrance was larger than it appeared, from outside a natural chamber about 15 feet across, with a ceiling just high enough for an adult to stand upright. As Jackson had promised, a small spring bubbled up from the rock at the rear, providing fresh water. Against one wall stood a crude shelf holding several tins of food matches and a rolled blanket, Jackson's emergency cache. "Help me sit," Jackson said, his voice rough with pain. Eleanor guided him to a relatively flat rock, where he sank down with a barely suppressed groan. In the growing light filtering through the cave entrance, Eleanor got her first clear look at his condition. Jackson's face was ashen, his eyes bright with fever. The bandage on his leg was soaked through with blood, and the wound beneath had begun to show signs of infection, the skin around it red and swollen. "This is bad," she said carefully, unwrapping the sodden cloth. "You need a doctor." "Not an option right now," Jackson replied. "There are supplies here. Whiskey for disinfection. Willow bark for the fever." Eleanor sent Abigail to fetch water from the spring while she examined the contents of Jackson's emergency stores. She found a small flask of whiskey, a packet of dried herbs she assumed was the willow bark he'd mentioned, and clean cloth that could serve as bandages. "This is going to hurt," she warned as she prepared to clean the wound. Jackson's mouth quirked in a pained smile. "I figured that." He gripped the edge of the rock beneath him as Eleanor poured whiskey over the entry and exit wounds. His entire body went rigid with pain, but he made no sound other than a sharp intake of breath. Abigail watched with wide, frightened eyes as Eleanor worked cleaning away dried blood and applying a poultice of herbs to the angry wounds before binding them with fresh bandages. "Will he die?" the child whispered when Eleanor finally sat back, her hands bloody from her efforts. "No," Jackson answered before Eleanor could respond. "I promised we wouldn't die, remember, and I keep my promises." But his voice lacked conviction, and Eleanor could see the fever taking hold, burning him from within as infection spread through his system. Without proper medical attention, Jackson's chances were grim. "You need to rest," she told him, helping him lie down on the blanket she'd spread over the cave floor. "Save your strength." Jackson didn't argue, a sign of how truly ill he was feeling. He allowed Eleanor to position him on the makeshift bed, his eyes already closing as exhaustion claimed him. Once he was settled, Eleanor led Abigail to the cave entrance where they could speak without disturbing him. "Is Mr. Thornhill going to die, Mama?" Abigail asked again, her voice small and frightened. Eleanor crouched to her daughter's level, meeting her eyes directly. "I don't know, sweetheart. He's very sick, and his wound is infected. But he's strong, and he's fighting hard." "Because of us?" the child said, her face solemn with understanding beyond her years. "He got hurt because he was protecting us." "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly. "Because of us." Abigail looked past her mother to the still form of the man who had risked everything for them, a stranger who had become their protector, their friend, perhaps something more. "Then we have to save him," she declared with simple certainty. "Like he saved us." Eleanor hugged her daughter close, drawing strength from the child's unwavering conviction. "Yes," she whispered into Abigail's hair. "We do." Outside, the dawn broke fully over the Montana wilderness, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. A new day had begun, bringing with it both danger and hope. Vernon Reed still hunted them, believing them dead, but determined to confirm it. Jackson's friend, the sheriff, might be searching for them, or might not yet know they needed help. And in a hidden cave by a frozen stream, a wounded man fought for his life, while a woman and child watched over him, determined that his sacrifice would not be in vain. Eleanor settled Abigail with a small breakfast from their supplies, then returned to Jackson's side. His breathing had grown labored, his skin hot to the touch despite the cave's cool air. She dampened a cloth in the spring water and placed it on his forehead, hoping to bring down the fever. Jackson, she called softly, unsure if he could hear her. Jackson, you need to fight. Abigail and I need you. His eyelids fluttered, then opened halfway. Eleanor, his voice was a rasp, barely audible. I'm here, she assured him, taking his hand in hers. Rest now. Save your strength. If I don't make it, he began. Don't, she interrupted. Don't say that. Listen, he insisted, his grip tightening on her hand with surprising strength. If I don't make it, take the southern trail from here. Follow the stream until you reach a fork, then go east. 2 days' walk will bring you to Clearwater. Ask for Frank Sullivan. Tell him Jackson sent you. Eleanor nodded, tears filling her eyes, despite her efforts to remain strong. I will, but it won't come to that. You're going to get through this. Jackson's eyes closed again, the brief moment of clarity fading as fever reclaimed him. Eleanor continued to bathe his face with cool water, watching helplessly as his condition deteriorated. Outside, the day brightened toward noon. Eleanor ventured to the cave entrance, occasionally checking for any sign of pursuit, but the forest remained quiet. Vernon Reed and his men were likely still at the cabin site searching the ashes for bodies they would never find. How long before they realized the truth? How long before they began searching the surrounding area? These questions haunted Eleanor as she tended to Jackson and tried to keep Abigail's spirits up. The child had been remarkably resilient throughout their ordeal, but even she had limits. By mid-afternoon, she had grown restless in the confines of the cave, asking repeatedly when Jackson would wake up, when they could leave, whether the bad men were still looking for them. I want to help, she said finally, her small face determined. Like you're helping Mr. Thornhill, what can I do? Eleanor considered the question. Giving Abigail a task would keep her occupied and might genuinely be useful. You can watch for anyone coming, she decided, but stay hidden and come back immediately if you see anything. Abigail nodded solemnly, accepting the responsibility with pride. I'll be careful, Mama. I promise. Eleanor positioned her near the cave entrance behind a screen of brush where she could observe the surrounding forest without being seen. Then she returned to Jackson, whose condition continued to worsen. His skin burned with fever, and his breathing had grown shallow and rapid. Don't you dare die, Jackson Thornhill, Eleanor whispered fiercely as she changed his bandages again, revealing angry red streaks spreading from the wound, blood poisoning setting in. Not after everything we've been through. She prepared more willow bark tea, forcing small sips between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. It wasn't enough without real medicine. Without a doctor, Jackson's chances diminished with each passing hour. By late afternoon, Eleanor had nearly given up hope. Jackson had slipped into unconsciousness, his breathing erratic, his pulse weak and thready beneath her fingertips. She sat beside him, holding his hand, tears streaming silently down her face. You saved us, she told him, though she wasn't sure he could hear. You gave us shelter when no one else would. You stood against Vernon when others looked away. She swallowed hard. You made me believe in goodness again, Jackson, in the possibility of a future. Don't leave us now, please. A sound from the cave entrance startled her. Abigail, running back from her lookout position, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. Mama, she whispered urgently. There are men coming, but they're wearing stars like in the stories. Hope surged through Eleanor. Stars like sheriffs. Abigail nodded vigorously. 3 of them. And they're calling Mr. Thornhill's name. Eleanor rose shakily to her feet. Stay with Mr. Thornhill, she instructed. I'll go see. She moved cautiously to the cave entrance, peering through the concealing brush. Sure enough, 3 men on horseback were moving slowly along the stream, looking carefully at the ground as if following a trail. All wore the distinctive badges of lawmen. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated. What if it was a trick? What if Vernon Reed had somehow convinced local authorities to help him search for them? But one of the men called out again, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Jackson! Jackson! Thornhill! It's Frank Sullivan! Where are you, you stubborn bastard?" The genuine concern in the man's voice decided her. Eleanor stepped from the cave entrance, waving her arms to attract their attention. "Here," she called. "Please, we need help. Jackson's been shot." The men wheeled their horses toward her, approaching rapidly. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and weathered face, reached her first. "Where is he?" he demanded without preamble. "In the cave," Eleanor replied, already turning back toward the entrance. "He's very ill. Infection has set in." Frank Sullivan dismounted in a fluid motion, signaling his deputies to follow. "I'm Frank Sullivan, Sheriff of Clearwater County." He introduced himself as they hurried into the cave. "Jackson and I served together in the war. I'm Eleanor Reed. Jackson took my daughter and me in when we were in trouble." She led them to where Jackson lay unconscious, Abigail kneeling anxiously beside him. Frank dropped to one knee, his expression grim as he examined his friend. "How long has he been like this?" "Since early this morning. He was shot last night during the attack." Eleanor explained quickly about Vernon Reed, the burning cabin, and their escape through the tunnel. "Vernon Reed?" Frank repeated, his jaw tightening. "I know him. Businessman from over in Pinesdale. Got a reputation for being hard on debtors." He looked up at Eleanor. "You're saying he did this, burned Jackson's place? Shot him?" "Yes. He's been pursuing us since we escaped his house. He's my brother-in-law. My husband's brother." Eleanor touched her shorn head self-consciously. "He did this to me, and worse." Frank's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "I see. Well, Mrs. Reed, you're safe now, and so is your daughter." He turned to one of his deputies. "Miller, ride back to town. Get Doc Williams out here with a wagon. Tell him to bring everything he's got for treating infection." The deputy nodded and hurried out. "How did you find us?" Eleanor asked, as Frank began examining Jackson's wound more closely. "Jackson didn't show up at the way station yesterday. The mail carrier told me he'd been expecting an important message from him." Frank's hands were gentle despite their size as he checked Jackson's pulse. "I knew something was wrong. Jackson's too reliable to miss an appointment like that without good reason." "So you came looking for him?" "Damn right I did. Found his cabin burned to the ground this morning with a bunch of men searching through the ashes." Frank's expression darkened. They claimed to be friends of Jackson's, concerned when they saw the fire. But something didn't sit right. So I had my deputies detain them while I looked around. "Did you find Vernon?" Eleanor asked anxiously. "If he was one of the men there, yes. Got 5 of them cooling their heels in my jail right now, pending investigation." Frank sat back on his heels, his gaze returning to Jackson. "How long were you at his cabin?" "Nearly a week. He found us in an abandoned shed, half frozen. Abigail led him to us after we escaped Vernon's house." Eleanor's voice caught. "He risked everything for us people he didn't even know." Frank nodded, unsurprised. "That sounds like Jackson. Always did have more courage than sense." His tone was gruff but fond. "But he's also the toughest son of a—" He glanced at Abigail, correcting himself. "The toughest man I know. If anyone can pull through this, it's him." His words offered Eleanor a glimmer of hope. "Will your doctor be able to help him? Doc Williams is the best in the territory. Patched me up after a shootout that should have put me in the ground. If anyone can save Jackson, it's him." Frank stood, his decision made. "We need to get him back to town. The sooner Doc can treat him, the better his chances." "Can he survive being moved?" Eleanor worried. "He won't survive if we leave him here," Frank replied bluntly. "The infection's spreading fast. He needs real medicine, not just herbs and whiskey." Eleanor nodded, accepting the harsh reality. "What can we do until the doctor arrives? Keep him cool, try to get water into him if he wakes, and pray if you're the praying type." Frank moved to the cave entrance where his remaining deputy waited. "Jenkins, we'll need a stretcher. Cut some branches, use your coat if you have to." As the men worked to prepare for transporting Jackson, Eleanor sat beside him once more, Abigail leaning against her shoulder. The child's face was solemn, her eyes never leaving Jackson's pale features. "The sheriff will help him, won't he, Mama?" she asked softly. Eleanor pulled her daughter close. "Yes, sweetheart. Jackson has good friends just like he told us. They'll help him get better." She hoped with all her heart that her words would prove true, that the doctor would arrive in time, that the infection could be fought, that Jackson would survive to see the new life he had made possible for them. But as she watched his labored breathing and felt the heat radiating from his fever-racked body, Eleanor knew that Jackson Thornhill's fate now hung in the balance. All they could do was wait and hope and hold on to the promise he had made them. "We will not die tonight." And Jackson Thornhill kept his promises. Twilight settled over Clearwater like a purple veil, casting long shadows across the town's main street. From her seat beside the window in Dr. Williams's front parlor, Eleanor watched lamplight bloom in windows along the thoroughfare, each one a beacon of ordinary life continuing undisturbed. How strange it seemed after the violence and terror of the past days. 2 doors down in the doctor's treatment room, Jackson Thornhill fought for his life. Eleanor shifted in her chair, wincing as the movement disturbed her healing wounds. Dr. Williams had insisted on examining her as well, his face grim when he'd seen the extent of the abuse she'd suffered at Vernon's hands. The cuts were beginning to heal, but the bruises still painted her body in mottled shades of purple and green. Abigail slept on a small settee nearby, exhaustion having finally claimed her after the harrowing journey from the cave to town. Sheriff Sullivan had carried the child for the last mile when her small legs could no longer keep pace. Now she lay curled beneath a borrowed quilt, her face peaceful in sleep for the first time in months. The door opened quietly, and Frank Sullivan entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Eleanor straightened, reading the news in his weathered face before he spoke. "How is he?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper to avoid waking Abigail. Frank settled heavily into a chair across from her. "Still fighting. Doc's removed the bullet fragments and cleaned the wound thoroughly. Says the next 12 hours will tell." Eleanor nodded, relief and fear warring within her. "And Vernon, his men, locked up tight in my jail." Frank's expression hardened. "They're claiming they were just following orders, that Vernon told them you were mentally unstable and had kidnapped Abigail. Said they were trying to rescue you both from Thornhill, who they claim was holding you against your will." "That's absurd," Eleanor exclaimed, then glanced quickly at Abigail, but the child slept on. She continued more softly. "Jackson saved our lives. Vernon was the one who—" Her hand rose unconsciously to her shorn head. "I know," Frank assured her. "Their story has more holes than a fishing net. And we found plenty of evidence at the cabin site, fire arrows, spent cartridges that match their weapons. Plus, Vernon's got a reputation around these parts. Not many will believe his version of events." "What will happen to them?" They'll stand trial. Attempted murder, arson, kidnapping, the charges are serious. Vernon won't walk away from this, Mrs. Reed. I promise you that. Frank leaned forward, his voice earnest. But I need your testimony and Jackson's when he's well enough. Will you be willing to speak in court? Eleanor thought of Vernon's face twisted with rage as he ordered his men to burn them out. She thought of the feel of shears against her scalp, the humiliation of being paraded through town, the terror of knowing Abigail might be taken from her forever. Yes, she said firmly. I'll tell everyone exactly what he did.
Frank nodded, satisfied. Good, but that's for later. Right now, you need rest. Doc says you're not fully healed yourself.
I can't rest, not until I know Jackson will recover. Eleanor glanced toward the door that separated them from the treatment room. Can I see him? Frank hesitated. Doc said no visitors yet. The risk of infection is too great. His expression softened at her obvious distress. I'll tell you what, I'll check again, see if Doc will allow you a brief look. No promises, though. Williams is as stubborn as they come. Thank you, Eleanor said gratefully. After Frank left to speak with the doctor, Eleanor moved to Abigail's side, gently brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. The child stirred slightly but didn't wake exhaustion, keeping her firmly in sleep's embrace. We're safe now, Eleanor whispered more to herself than to Abigail. Because of him. The door opened again and Frank beckoned silently. Eleanor rose, following him through to the treatment room, where Jackson lay motionless on a narrow bed, his skin ashen against the white sheets. Dr. Williams, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, stood beside the bed, monitoring Jackson's pulse. He glanced up as they entered. 5 minutes, he said firmly. He needs absolute quiet to conserve his strength. Eleanor approached the bed, heart constricting at the sight of Jackson's condition. His leg was heavily bandaged, elevated on pillows. His breathing was shallow, his face gaunt with fever and pain, but he was alive. May I? She asked, gesturing toward his hand resting on the blanket. The doctor nodded reluctantly. Briefly, Eleanor took Jackson's hand in hers, alarmed at the heat still radiating from his skin. Jackson, she said softly. It's Eleanor. We're safe now. Abigail is safe. Your friend Frank found us. For a moment, there was no response. Then Jackson's fingers twitched slightly against hers, a flicker of movement so faint she might have imagined it. But Dr. Williams noticed as well, his eyebrows rising in surprise. He hears you, he said, professional interest overcoming his earlier reticence. Talk to him more. Encouraged, Eleanor continued. We're in town in Dr. Williams's house. Vernon and his men are in jail. They can't hurt us anymore. She squeezed his hand gently. You kept your promise, Jackson. We didn't die that night. Now you have to keep fighting. You have to live. Jackson's eyelids fluttered, though they didn't open. His fingers curled weakly around hers. Remarkable, the doctor murmured. He's responding to your voice when he's been unresponsive to all other stimuli. He checked Jackson's pulse again, then made a note on a pad of paper. His heart rate has strengthened. Continue speaking to him, Mrs. Reed. It seems to be having a positive effect. Eleanor hardly needed the encouragement. For the next several minutes, she spoke softly to Jackson, telling him about Abigail's bravery, about Sheriff Sullivan's kindness, about the safe room the doctor had prepared for them upstairs. She spoke of ordinary things, the view from the window, the spring flowers beginning to appear in the town square, the kindness of the local women who had brought clothing for her and Abigail. Throughout it all, Jackson's hand remained clasped in hers, his grip occasionally tightening as if to confirm he was listening. Finally, Dr. Williams signaled that her time was up. He needs rest now, and so do you. But you may return in the morning." He hesitated, then added with grudging approval, "Your presence seems to be good medicine, Mrs. Reed." Eleanor reluctantly released Jackson's hand. "Thank you for saving him," she said. "He's not saved yet," the doctor cautioned. "The infection is severe, and he's lost a great deal of blood. But he's stronger than I initially thought." He adjusted Jackson's blanket with practiced efficiency. "If he makes it through the night, his chances improve significantly." Frank escorted Eleanor back to the parlor where Abigail still slept peacefully. "You should rest too," he advised. "There's a bedroom upstairs prepared for you and your daughter. I'll wake you if there's any change in Jackson's condition." Eleanor knew he was right. Exhaustion weighed on her like a physical burden, but the thought of sleeping while Jackson fought for his life seemed impossible. "Just a little longer," she said, returning to her chair by the window. "I want to be close, in case—" Frank nodded, understanding what she couldn't bring herself to say. "I'll be in the sheriff's office across the street if you need anything. My deputy is stationed outside to make sure no one disturbs you." After Frank left, Eleanor sat in the gathering darkness, watching as the town settled into night. Across the street, lights burned in the sheriff's office, where Frank would be processing the prisoners and preparing charges. Further down the street, the saloon was alive with music and voices, the Saturday night revelry, a stark contrast to the quiet vigil she kept. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the future, something she had scarcely allowed herself to contemplate during the dark days at Vernon's house or the desperate flight that followed. What would happen once Jackson recovered? Would they continue to Boston as planned? And after that, the uncertainty loomed large, but for the first time it didn't feel threatening. Whatever came next, they would face it from a position of strength, not fear. Vernon's power over them was broken, and with it, the sense of helplessness that had dominated her life since Harold's death. As midnight approached, Eleanor finally yielded to exhaustion. She gathered Abigail in her arms, the child barely stirring, as she was carried upstairs to the small bedroom Dr. Williams had prepared. Eleanor settled her daughter in the bed, then lay down beside her, too tired to even remove her borrowed dress. She meant to close her eyes for just a moment, but sleep claimed her, instantly drawing her into dreamless darkness. Damned. The scent of coffee roused Eleanor the next morning. She opened her eyes to find sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains and Abigail sitting up in bed beside her, already dressed in a simple blue frock provided by one of the town's residents. "Good morning, Mama," the child said, her voice bright with renewed energy. "Mrs. Williams brought us breakfast. She said Mr. Thornhill is awake." Eleanor sat up so quickly that her head spun. "Truly, he's conscious." "That's what she said. Can we go see him? Please." Abigail's eyes were eager, her earlier fear replaced by excitement. "Let me get dressed first," Eleanor replied, already reaching for the modest dress laid out on a nearby chair. Her heart raced with hope and anxiety. If Jackson was awake, it meant the fever had broken, that he was fighting his way back from the brink. Minutes later, they descended to the main floor, where Mrs. Williams, the doctor's plump, cheerful wife, was pouring coffee in the kitchen. "There you are, dears," she exclaimed. "I was just about to bring this up. Dr. Williams said you might want to take breakfast with your friend. He woke about an hour ago asking for you both." Eleanor felt a wave of relief so profound that her knees nearly buckled. "He's really better. The fever broke around dawn. He's weak as a newborn calf, but alert and determined to see you." Mrs. Williams handed Eleanor a tray with coffee toast and soft-boiled eggs. "My husband says he's never seen anyone recover so quickly from blood poisoning. Says it's nothing short of miraculous." "Can I carry something?" Abigail asked, eager to help. Mrs. Williams smiled, handing her a small pitcher of cream. Careful now, it's full to the brim. They followed Mrs. Williams to the treatment room, where the door stood ajar. Inside, Dr. Williams was changing Jackson's bandages, his movements precise and efficient. Jackson lay propped against pillows, his face still pale, but his eyes, those clear gray eyes Eleanor had come to know, alert and aware. "Visitors for you, Thornhill," Dr. Williams announced. "Though I've told them you're to remain calm and quiet. No excitement that might raise your temperature again." Jackson's gaze moved past the doctor to find Eleanor and Abigail in the doorway. A smile, weak but genuine, transformed his haggard face. "There you are," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I was beginning to think I'd dreamed you both." Abigail darted forward, only remembering the pitcher of cream at the last moment, and slowing her approach. "Mr. Thornhill, you're not going to die." "Abigail," Eleanor admonished gently, though Jackson's smile only widened. "Told you I keep my promises," he said to the girl. "No dying allowed." Dr. Williams finished securing the fresh bandage, then straightened. 20 minutes, he instructed firmly. "Then my patient needs rest." After the doctor left, Eleanor set the breakfast tray on a small table and drew chairs close to the bed for herself and Abigail. Up close, she could see that despite his improved condition, Jackson was still dangerously weak. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his cheekbones stood out sharply against his skin. "You gave us quite a scare," she said, pouring coffee into a cup and adding cream from Abigail's carefully transported pitcher. "Didn't mean to," Jackson replied. He accepted the coffee with a slightly trembling hand. "How long was I out?" "Nearly 2 days. You developed a severe infection from the gunshot wound. Dr. Williams wasn't sure you'd survive." Jackson took a careful sip of coffee as if testing whether his body would accept it. "What happened after Frank found us? My memory's a bit hazy." Eleanor explained how the sheriff and his deputies had transported him to town with Eleanor and Abigail following behind. How Dr. Williams had immediately set to work removing bullet fragments and cleaning the infected wound. How Vernon and his men were now in the town jail awaiting charges. "Frank came by earlier," Jackson said. "Told me they found evidence at the cabin site that backs up our story. Said Vernon's spinning tales, but no one's buying them." "Good." Eleanor couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "I want him to pay for what he did. To all of us." Jackson studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Frank mentioned a trial. Said you'd agreed to testify." "I have." Eleanor lifted her chin slightly. "I'm not afraid of Vernon anymore. Let everyone hear what kind of man he really is." Pride flickered in Jackson's eyes. "You're braver than you give yourself credit for, Eleanor Reed." "I had a good teacher," she replied softly. Abigail, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Will your leg be all right?" "Mr. Thornhill," Dr. Williams said the bullet went all the way through. Dr. Jackson glanced down at his bandaged limb. "It'll heal. Might walk with a limp for a while, but I've had worse." "Will you still be able to check your traps?" the child asked anxiously. "And chop wood for the fire." A shadow crossed Jackson's face. "My cabin's gone, Abigail. Burned to the ground. I'll have to rebuild before I worry about traps." Eleanor caught the note of loss in his voice. That cabin had been more than just shelter. It had been his home, built with his own hands, filled with memories of Catherine and the life he'd carved out for himself in the wilderness. "We'll help you rebuild," she said impulsively. "When you're stronger." Jackson's gaze shifted to her surprise, evident in his expression. "You still plan to go to Boston, don't you? To find Harold's lawyer?" The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Eleanor hadn't intended to make such an offer. It had emerged unbidden, a revelation of desires she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. "Yes, eventually," she said carefully. "But there's no rush now that Vernon is in custody, and we owe you a debt we can never fully repay." "You owe me nothing," Jackson replied, his voice suddenly gruff. "You would have done the same for me. Perhaps, but the fact remains that you lost your home because of us. The least we can do is help you rebuild." Before Jackson could respond, Abigail chimed in, "Can we live there too?" "With Mr. Thornhill, I liked his cabin. It was cozy, and he has books, and he could teach me more about tracking animals." "Abigail," Eleanor began, embarrassed by her daughter's directness, but Jackson interrupted gently. "It's all right. She asks good questions." He turned his attention to the child. "Building a new cabin would take time, Abigail, and it might not be as comfortable as living in town." "I don't care," the girl declared firmly. "Towns have too many people. I like the quiet in the forest." And Mama smiled more there before the bad men came. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at her daughter's innocent observation. Had she really been so different at Jackson's cabin, so visibly happier despite their precarious situation? Jackson's eyes found hers, searching for confirmation or denial of Abigail's words. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze directly, afraid of what he might read in her expression. "We have time to figure things out," she said finally. "Right now, you need to focus on getting well." Jackson seemed about to press the issue when Dr. Williams returned, frowning at the half-eaten breakfast on the tray. "You need nourishment to regain your strength, Thornhill," he admonished. "And you ladies need fresh air. It's a fine spring day, and Mrs. Williams tells me the milliner's shop has some new bonnets that might interest you." Eleanor recognized the doctor's tactful suggestion that they conclude their visit. She rose, gathering the breakfast dishes. "We'll come back later if that's all right." "I'd like that," Jackson replied. Something in his tone made Eleanor look up, meeting his gaze at last. What she saw there, warmth, question, hope, sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with fear. Abigail leaned over to pat Jackson's hand solemnly. "Don't worry, Mr. Thornhill. We won't go away before you get better. Mama promised." As they left, Eleanor caught the ghost of a smile on Dr. Williams's face. The doctor, it seemed, had observed more than just his patient's physical condition. Outside, the day was indeed fine, with a warm breeze carrying hints of approaching summer. Eleanor and Abigail walked slowly along Clearwater's main street, a modest thoroughfare with wooden sidewalks and a dozen or so businesses catering to the town's residents and the surrounding farms and homesteads. "It's nice here," Abigail observed, peering into shop windows with interest. "But not as nice as Mr. Thornhill's forest." Eleanor couldn't help but smile at her daughter's persistence. "You've become quite fond of Mr. Thornhill, haven't you?" Abigail nodded emphatically. "He doesn't treat me like I'm stupid, just because I'm a child. And he makes you smile, Mama. You hardly ever smiled at Uncle Vernon's house." "There wasn't much to smile about there," Eleanor admitted. She hesitated, then knelt to Abigail's level despite the curious glances of passers-by. "Abby, I need to ask you something important. Would you really be happy living in a cabin in the woods, far from other children from schools and shops?" The child considered the question with endearing seriousness. "I think so. I like learning things from books, and Mr. Thornhill has lots of books. And he said he was a teacher once, so he could teach me other things too." Her small face grew solemn. "And I don't want to leave him all alone again. He gets sad when he thinks no one can see." Eleanor was struck anew by her daughter's perceptiveness. In the few days they had spent with Jackson, Abigail had discerned the loneliness and grief that lay beneath his stoic exterior, something Eleanor herself had only gradually come to recognize. "Well," she said, rising to her feet again, "we don't need to decide anything right away. For now, let's explore the town a bit, shall we?" As they continued their walk, Eleanor found her thoughts repeatedly returning to Jackson and to Abigail's innocent observations. There was truth in the child's words. Eleanor had felt something awaken within her during their stay at the cabin, a sense of possibility that had been absent since Harold's death. But was it merely gratitude she felt for Jackson? Appreciation for his protection and kindness? Or was it something more? Something that had taken root in the quiet moments by the fire, in their shared vigilance, in the unspoken understanding that had grown between them? These questions occupied her throughout the day as they explored Clearwater, a clean, orderly town with a church, a schoolhouse, and a small but well-stocked general store. Everyone they met greeted them kindly, though Eleanor noticed curious glances at her shorn head now growing out in a short, uneven fuzz. By late afternoon, they returned to Dr. Williams's house, where Mrs. Williams informed them that Jackson had been moved to a room upstairs, his condition continuing to improve steadily. "My husband says he's never seen anyone with such determination to recover quickly," she confided as she served them tea in the parlor. "Says Mr. Thornhill's been asking when he can get up and start walking." "Well, that sounds like him," Eleanor said, smiling despite her concern. "He's not one to remain idle for long." "Well, he'll have to learn patience. That leg needs time to heal properly." Mrs. Williams poured milk into Abigail's teacup. "Sheriff Sullivan came by while you were out. He says the judge will arrive next week to hear preliminary charges against Mr. Reed and his associates." Eleanor's smile faded. "So soon. Judge Harmon only comes through every 2 months. Sheriff didn't want to wait for the next circuit." Mrs. Williams patted Eleanor's hand sympathetically. "It's better this way, dear. Get it over with, so you can move forward." Eleanor nodded, though the prospect of facing Vernon in court so soon was daunting. She had hoped for more time for her physical wounds to heal completely, time for Jackson to regain his strength, time to sort through the complicated emotions that had begun to stir within her. After finishing their tea, Eleanor took Abigail upstairs to the room they shared for a brief rest before dinner. As they passed the closed door of Jackson's new quarters, she hesitated, wondering if he was awake, if he might welcome another visit. As if sensing her thoughts, the door opened, revealing Dr. Williams. "Ah, Mrs. Reed, good timing," he said. "My patient is being exceptionally stubborn and insists on speaking with you. Perhaps you can convince him that trying to get out of bed is premature and ill-advised." From inside the room, Jackson's voice called out, "I'm not dead yet, Williams. Stop talking about me like I am." The doctor rolled his eyes expressively. 10 minutes, then he needs to rest. He stepped aside to allow Eleanor and Abigail to enter, then departed muttering about the stubbornness of frontiersmen. Jackson was sitting up in bed, his color markedly improved since morning. He had been freshly shaved and his hair was damp as if recently washed. The overall effect was startling. Without the beard and grime of their ordeal, he looked younger, less weathered, though no less formidable. "You clean up well, Mr. Thornhill," Eleanor observed, trying for a lightness she didn't entirely feel. A hint of color touched Jackson's cheeks. "Mrs. Williams insisted. Said I was frightening the household with my wild appearance." Abigail climbed onto the chair beside the bed, her earlier shyness completely gone. "You look different without your beard. Younger." "Do I?" Jackson rubbed his smooth jaw self-consciously. "Haven't been without it since before the war. Feels strange." Eleanor took the seat on the opposite side of the bed, noting the improvements in Jackson's condition. His eyes were clear now, alert and focused. His hands no longer trembled when he reached for the glass of water beside him. "Mrs. Williams says you've been trying to get up," she said, unable to keep a note of reproach from her voice. "The doctor says your leg needs time to heal." "Williams worries too much. I've been injured before." "Not like this," Eleanor countered. "You nearly died, Jackson." Something in her tone, perhaps the genuine concern, perhaps the use of his given name, seemed to reach him. His expression softened. "I know, but I can't stay in bed forever. There's too much to do. Such as, Frank tells me the judge arrives next week. You'll need someone beside you when you face Vernon in court." Eleanor was touched by his concern, though she tried not to show it. "Sheriff Sullivan will be there, and the whole town seems to be on our side." "It's not the same," Jackson insisted. "Vernon hurt you, threatened your child. You shouldn't have to face him alone." "I won't be alone. Abigail will be with me." Eleanor glanced at her daughter, who was listening to their conversation with rapt attention. "And perhaps it's better this way. I need to show Vernon and myself that I'm not afraid anymore." Jackson studied her face, seeming to search for something. Whatever he saw there appeared to satisfy him, for he nodded slowly. "All right, but I'll be in that courtroom even if Williams has to carry me in." Eleanor felt a rush of warmth at his protectiveness, even as she maintained her composure. "We'll see. For now, focus on getting stronger." They spoke of lighter matters, then Abigail's exploration of the town, the kindness of Clearwater's residents, the spring weather that promised an early summer. Throughout it all, Eleanor was acutely aware of a shift in her relationship with Jackson. Here, in the civilized setting of Dr. Williams's home, without the immediate threat of danger, she found herself noticing things she had been too preoccupied to fully acknowledge before: the intelligence in his gray eyes, the quiet humor that occasionally surfaced in his remarks, the gentle way he listened to Abigail's enthusiastic observations. When Dr. Williams returned to usher them out, insisting his patient needed rest, Eleanor found herself reluctant to leave, and judging by the look Jackson gave her as they departed, he felt the same. "Will we see Mr. Thornhill tomorrow?" Abigail asked, as Eleanor tucked her into bed that night. "I expect so," Eleanor replied, "if the doctor allows it." Abigail yawned sleepily. "Good. I like seeing him. He looks happier when you're there, Mama." Eleanor smoothed her daughter's hair, wondering at the child's perceptiveness. "Does he now? His eyes follow you when you move around the room, like Papa's used to do." The innocent observation caught Eleanor off guard. She hadn't realized that Abigail had noticed such things between her and Harold, or that she was drawing parallels to Jackson's behavior now. "It's time to sleep," she said, gently deflecting the conversation. "Tomorrow will be another busy day." But as Abigail drifted off, Eleanor found herself pondering the child's words. Was Jackson truly watching her with interest? And more importantly, how did she feel about the possibility? The days that followed settled into a routine of sorts. Each morning, Eleanor and Abigail would visit Jackson after breakfast, often bringing books or newspapers to read aloud. In the afternoons, they explored Clearwater or helped Mrs. Williams with household tasks. Evenings were spent in the parlor, where Jackson, eventually permitted by Dr. Williams to leave his room for short periods, would join them for conversation before retiring early to rest his healing leg. As the day of the preliminary hearing approached, Eleanor met with Frank Sullivan to discuss her testimony. The sheriff was thorough and kind, but he didn't soften the reality of what lay ahead. "Vernon's hired a lawyer from Billings," he told her. "Man named Hargrove with a reputation for aggressive questioning. He'll try to paint you as unstable just like Vernon claimed. He'll bring up your appearance, imply that you cut your own hair in some fit of madness." Eleanor touched her head, where short hair had begun to grow back in uneven patches. "Let him try. The truth is written on my body. Every cut, every bruise tells the story of what Vernon did." Frank nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. Just remember, keep your answers clear and direct. Don't let Hargrove rattle you." On the morning of the hearing, Eleanor, dressed carefully in a simple but dignified dress provided by one of Clearwater's residents. Mrs. Williams helped arrange a small hat with a partial veil that softened but didn't hide her growing hair. "There," the older woman said, stepping back to assess her work. "Respectable, but not hiding anything. Let them see what was done to you." Abigail wore her best dress, her hair neatly braided and tied with ribbons. The child was solemn, understanding the importance of the day, even if she didn't grasp all the legal implications. "Will Uncle Vernon try to take me away again?" she asked as they prepared to leave for the courthouse. Eleanor knelt to her level, meeting her eyes directly. "No, sweetheart. He can't hurt us anymore. Today is about making sure he pays for what he did." "Will he go to jail?" "I hope so." Eleanor saw no reason to shield her daughter from this truth. What he did was very wrong, and there are consequences for such actions. A knock at their door announced Jackson, leaning heavily on a cane but dressed in a clean shirt and trousers borrowed from Frank. He had refused to regrow his beard, though a shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. "Ready?" he asked simply. Eleanor nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. "As I'll ever be." They made their way slowly to the courthouse, Jackson's injured leg necessitating a measured pace. The town's residents nodded respectfully as they passed, many offering words of encouragement. News of Vernon Reed's actions had spread quickly in the small community, and public opinion had solidified firmly against him. The courthouse was a modest wooden structure recently built and still smelling of fresh-cut lumber. Inside benches had been arranged to accommodate the unusually large crowd that had gathered for the proceedings. At the front, a simple table served as the judge's bench, with smaller tables for the prosecution and defense. Frank Sullivan escorted them to seats near the front, directly behind the prosecution table, where the county attorney, a serious young man named Howard Mills, was arranging his papers. "Remember," Frank murmured to Eleanor, "just tell the truth as it happened. Mills will guide you through your testimony." The room fell silent as Vernon Reed was led in, flanked by deputies. Eleanor felt a chill run through her at the sight of him, tall, broad-shouldered, with the distinctive scar across his cheek that had featured in so many of her nightmares. He was dressed in a suit that had seen better days, but still conveyed an air of respectability. Vernon's eyes found her immediately, his gaze hardening when he saw Jackson beside her. A muscle twitched in his jaw, but he said nothing as he was directed to the defense table where a thin man with a meticulously trimmed mustache waited. "That's Hargrove," Frank whispered, "the lawyer from Billings." Jackson's hand found Eleanor's, squeezing gently in silent support. She returned the pressure, grateful for his presence. The proceedings began with Judge Harmon, a stern-faced man with white sideburns, calling the court to order. The charges were read: attempted murder, arson, kidnapping, assault, a litany of crimes that made several members of the audience gasp. Vernon's attorney entered a plea of not guilty on all counts, claiming his client had been attempting to rescue his mentally disturbed sister-in-law and niece from a dangerous situation. "Mrs. Reed has been unwell since her husband's death," Hargrove stated smoothly. "Mr. Reed was acting out of concern for her welfare and that of the child who is, after all, his niece by blood." The prosecution presented its case first, calling Frank Sullivan to testify about finding Jackson's burned cabin and the subsequent discovery of Vernon and his men searching the ashes. "They claimed to be friends of Thornhill's," Frank recalled, concerned about the fire. "But none of them could tell me Thornhill's first name or how long they'd known him. And they had firearms rifles with custom ammunition that matched casings we found at the scene. Next came Dr. Williams, who described in clinical detail the injuries sustained by both Jackson and Eleanor. His testimony was particularly damning when he noted that the pattern of cuts on Eleanor's scalp could only have been caused by someone deliberately using shears on an unwilling subject. In my professional opinion, he concluded, Mrs. Reed's injuries were consistent with sustained physical abuse. The shaving of her head was done forcibly and with intent to cause both physical pain and psychological distress. Throughout these testimonies, Eleanor sat rigid, her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at Vernon. Beside her, Jackson remained a steady presence, his face impassive, but his eyes never leaving Vernon Reed's face, as if memorizing every reaction, every gesture. Finally, it was Eleanor's turn to testify. She rose on legs that felt suddenly weak, but her voice was strong as she swore to tell the truth. Mills guided her gently through her account. Harold's death, Vernon's initial kindness, followed by escalating control and abuse. The desperate escape with Abigail, their discovery by Jackson, and the subsequent attack on the cabin. "And why would your brother-in-law go to such lengths to find you?" Mills asked. What was his motivation? Eleanor took a deep breath. Harold left his estate to our daughter Abigail. Vernon believed he could contest the will if he could prove Abigail wasn't Harold's biological child. A murmur ran through the courtroom at this revelation. Mills waited for it to subside before continuing. "And is Abigail your husband's biological child?" "She is my child in every way that matters," Eleanor replied firmly. "She is the daughter of my sister who died in childbirth. Harold and I adopted her as an infant, raised her as our own. Harold filed legal adoption papers in Boston to ensure her inheritance would be secure. And Mr. Reed knew this. He discovered it after Harold's death when he found letters from my sister among my possessions. He believed that if he could prevent me from accessing the adoption papers, he could claim the inheritance for himself as Harold's only living blood relative." Mills nodded, satisfied with her answers. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Harmon turned to the defense table. "Mr. Hargrove, your witness." Vernon's lawyer approached Eleanor with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Reed, you've told us quite a tale, but I'm curious about certain inconsistencies." He paced slowly before her. "You claim my client abused you, yet you never reported this alleged abuse to local authorities in Pinesdale. Why is that?" "Vernon controlled every aspect of our lives," Eleanor replied steadily. "We were virtual prisoners in his house. He spread rumors that I was mentally unstable, ensuring that no one would believe me if I did seek help." Yes, these rumors." Hargrove's tone was skeptical. "Yet you admit that you did something rather unusual. You took your young daughter and fled into a blizzard with no provisions, no plan, no destination in mind. Some might consider that the action of someone not thinking clearly." Eleanor felt a flash of anger, but controlled it. "It was desperate, yes, but it was also the only chance we had. Vernon had threatened to have me committed to an asylum and to take Abigail permanently." "So you claim. And then you ended up at Mr. Thornhill's cabin, a man who lives alone, far from civilization, a man with no family or community ties. Didn't it occur to you that you might be placing yourself and your daughter in even greater danger?" Before Eleanor could respond, Jackson's voice cut through the courtroom. "Objection!" Judge Harmon looked startled. "Mr. Thornhill, you are not an attorney. You cannot raise objections." "Maybe not," Jackson replied, his voice level but intense. "But I can speak the truth. Mrs. Reed and her daughter were half frozen and injured when they came to my cabin. They had been beaten, humiliated, and left to die. I gave them shelter because it was the right thing to do, the only thing any decent man would do. The judge rapped his gavel. Mr. Thornhill, you will have your chance to testify. Until then, please remain silent. Hargrove seized on the interruption. It seems Mr. Thornhill is quite protective of you, Mrs. Reed. One might almost think there was a personal interest involved. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Thornhill saved our lives, at great risk to his own. He lost his home defending us from Vernon and his men. If that creates a bond between us, it is one of gratitude and respect. The lawyer smiled thinly. Indeed. And did this bond develop before or after you took up residence in his isolated cabin, sharing his private quarters? Objection. This time it was Mills who spoke. Your Honor, Mr. Hargrove is attempting to impugn Mrs. Reed's character when she is the victim in this case. Sustained, Judge Harmon ruled. Mr. Hargrove, confine your questions to the relevant facts. The defense attorney bowed slightly. Of course, Your Honor. Mrs. Reed, let's discuss the night of the alleged attack on Mr. Thornhill's cabin. You claim my client and his associates attempted to burn down the structure with you inside. Yet you somehow escaped unharmed. How exactly did that happen? Eleanor hesitated, glancing at Jackson. They had agreed not to mention the hidden cellar or escape tunnel unless absolutely necessary. Such knowledge could make Jackson vulnerable to future attacks. We were fortunate, she said finally. The fire spread slowly due to recent snowmelt. We were able to find shelter until it was safe to leave. How convenient, Hargrove remarked. And then you wandered through the wilderness until Sheriff Sullivan happened upon you. Another fortunate coincidence. There was nothing coincidental about it, Eleanor replied. Mr. Thornhill had arranged to meet Sheriff Sullivan at a way station. When he didn't appear as scheduled, the sheriff came looking for him. Hargrove pressed her on various details, attempting to find inconsistencies in her account, but Eleanor remained composed, her responses clear and direct. Finally, apparently frustrated by his inability to rattle her, the lawyer returned to his table. No further questions, Your Honor. Jackson testified next, his account corroborating Eleanor's in every detail. Despite Hargrove's attempts to portray him as a recluse with questionable motives, Jackson's straightforward manner and Frank Sullivan's vouching for his character made a strong impression on the judge and spectators. The final witness was Abigail herself, though Mills had assured Eleanor that the child would not be subjected to cross-examination due to her age. The girl sat bravely in the witness chair, her feet dangling above the floor, and answered simple questions about what she had seen and heard at Vernon's house and during their escape. Uncle Vernon hurt Mama, she stated clearly. He cut off all her hair and called her terrible names. He locked us in our room at night so we couldn't leave. He said I wasn't really Papa's daughter, but Papa loved me and said I was his little girl forever. Her simple testimony, delivered with childish directness, seemed to affect the courtroom more powerfully than all the previous accounts. Even Judge Harmon's stern expression softened as he listened. When the final witness had been heard, the judge called a brief recess before delivering his ruling. Eleanor Jackson and Abigail stepped outside for some air, the tension of the proceedings having taken a visible toll. You did well in there, Jackson told Eleanor as they stood on the courthouse steps. Held your ground against Hargrove's tricks. I was terrified, she admitted, but seeing Vernon in chains unable to hurt us, it helped. Will the judge believe us? Abigail asked, her small hand clutching Eleanor's skirt. Before either adult could respond, Frank Sullivan joined them, his expression encouraging. Harmon's a fair man, and the evidence is overwhelming. He glanced at the courthouse doors. They're calling us back in. It's time. Inside, the crowded room fell silent as Judge Harmon took his seat. Vernon Reed stood with his attorney, his face impassive, but his eyes burning with suppressed rage. Having heard the testimony and examined the evidence, the judge began, "I find sufficient cause to bind the defendant over for trial on all charges. Bail is denied due to the severity of the alleged crimes and the risk of flight." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the spectators. Vernon's face darkened, but he remained silent as the judge continued. "Additionally, I am issuing a protective order barring the defendant from any contact with Mrs. Reed or her daughter. Mr. Reed will be remanded to the county jail to await trial, which I am scheduling for the first week of July." He struck his gavel decisively. "Court is adjourned." As Vernon was led away, he turned suddenly, his eyes finding Eleanor. "This isn't over," he called out, his voice cold with hatred. "Blood tells sister. The truth will come out." The deputies hurried him from the room before he could say more, but his words lingered in the air like poison. Eleanor felt a shiver run through her despite the warmth of the crowded room. "Pay him no mind," Frank advised, noting her reaction. "He's desperate and knows he's facing serious time." Eleanor nodded, though she couldn't quite shake the unease Vernon's parting words had stirred. She felt Jackson's hand at her elbow, steadying her. "It's over," he said quietly. "He can't hurt you anymore." But was it truly over? Eleanor wondered as they left the courthouse. Vernon would stand trial, would likely be convicted given the evidence against them. But his threat lingered. This isn't over. What did he have planned? What resources might he still command from his jail cell? These questions troubled her throughout the remainder of the day, casting a shadow over what should have been a moment of triumph and relief. That evening, after Abigail had been tucked into bed, Eleanor found Jackson sitting on the Williamses' front porch, his injured leg propped on a stool, his face thoughtful as he watched the last light fade from the sky. "May I join you?" she asked. He nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts." Eleanor settled into the chair, drawing her shawl closer against the evening chill. "Vernon's words keep repeating in my mind. This isn't over." What did he mean? Jackson considered the question, his expression grave. Could be just empty threats. A man like that hates to lose, especially to those he considers beneath him. Perhaps. Eleanor wasn't convinced. But he seemed so certain, as if he knew something we don't. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Jackson's gaze shifted to her, his eyes serious in the gathering darkness. "If you want to, that is." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Eleanor felt a flutter of something that wasn't quite fear but carried the same intensity. "What happens now, Jackson?" she asked softly. "After all this?" He was silent for a long moment, considering his response. "That depends on you, I suppose. You mentioned Boston finding Harold's lawyer, securing Abigail's inheritance. That's still important." "Yes, but after that?" Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how to express the thoughts that had been forming in her mind over the past days. "Abigail has grown quite attached to you, to the idea of rebuilding your cabin." A smile touched Jackson's lips. "She's made that clear. That child doesn't believe in hiding her thoughts." "No, she doesn't." Eleanor took a deep breath. "But she's not the only one who's grown attached." Jackson went very still, his eyes never leaving her face. "Eleanor, I know it's too soon," she hurried on. "We've known each other only a short time under extraordinary circumstances. And there's Vernon's trial ahead and Boston and so much uncertainty. But I find myself thinking about the future now in a way I haven't since Harold died, thinking about possibilities. What kind of possibilities? Jackson's voice was low, careful. Eleanor met his gaze directly. A home, a life that isn't defined by fear or loss, a chance to start again. She paused, gathering her courage. With you, if that's something you might want too. The silence that followed seemed endless. Then Jackson reached across the space between them, his hand finding hers warm and solid and real. I thought I was done with hope, he said quietly. After Catherine, after the war, I built that cabin to hide from the world, not to make a home. His fingers tightened around hers. But then you and Abigail came, and suddenly the cabin wasn't just shelter anymore. It was filled with voices, with life. And when it burned, I realized what I'd really lost wasn't the structure, but the promise of what it could become. Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes, though whether from sorrow or joy, she couldn't have said. We can rebuild it, make it better than before. We can, Jackson agreed. His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. But first, Boston. We need to secure Abigail's future, make sure Vernon can never threaten her inheritance again. We, Eleanor caught the pronoun, her heart quickening. Jackson smiled a real smile that transformed his face. If you'll have me as an escort. The city can be dangerous for a woman traveling alone, especially one with Vernon Reed's enemies. I'd like that, Eleanor said softly. Very much. They sat in comfortable silence, then hands joined watching as stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. The future still held uncertainties. Vernon's trial. The journey to Boston, the challenge of rebuilding not just a cabin, but lives shattered by violence and loss. But in that moment on a porch in a small Montana town, with the warmth of Jackson's hand in hers, Eleanor felt something she had nearly forgotten. Hope, fragile but persistent, like the first green shoots after a harsh winter. And she knew with a certainty that defied rational explanation that whatever came next, they would face it together. 3 months later, as summer reached its peak, a wagon made its slow way along the trail to Broken Fir Creek. In the driver's seat, Jackson Thornhill guided the horses with practiced hands, his injured leg almost fully healed now, though Dr. Williams had warned he might always walk with a slight limp in cold weather. Beside him sat Eleanor, her hair growing out in a soft cap of brown curls that caught the sunlight. In the back of the wagon, surrounded by supplies, Abigail knelt excitedly pointing out familiar landmarks as they approached the site of Jackson's former cabin. Look, Mama, there's the big pine tree where Mr. Thornhill showed me the owl's nest. I see it, sweetheart, Eleanor replied, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm. And it's Jackson, now, remember, not Mr. Thornhill. Jackson, Abigail corrected herself, the name still new on her tongue. Do you think the chickens will like their new coop? The one you designed is much bigger than the old one. Expect they'll adjust just fine, Jackson said, glancing back at the child with affection. Chickens aren't particularly fussy about architecture. Their journey to Boston had been successful beyond expectations. Harold's lawyer had been delighted to see them, having worried when his letters to Eleanor went unanswered. The adoption papers were exactly where Harold had said they would be, along with documentation of Vernon's embezzlement from the family business. Armed with these papers, they had returned to Montana in time for Vernon's trial. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury's deliberation brief. Vernon Reed was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, his power over Eleanor and Abigail broken forever. With Abigail's inheritance secured and Vernon behind bars, they had turned their attention to rebuilding. The plans for the new cabin were ambitious, larger than the original, with proper bedrooms, a dedicated space for Jackson's books, and even a small area where Eleanor could set up the piano they had purchased in Boston. As they crested the final rise, the clearing came into view. The burned ruins of the old cabin had been cleared away, and the foundation for the new structure was already in place, thanks to Frank Sullivan and a group of volunteers from Clearwater who had worked through the early summer to prepare the site. Home. Abigail sighed happily from the back of the wagon. We're finally home. Jackson's eyes met Eleanor's, a question in their depths, despite all that had passed between them. Are you sure about this? It's not too late to change your mind. Clearwater has a fine school proper society. Eleanor placed her hand over his on the reins. I've never been more certain of anything, she said simply. And it was true. The journey to Boston, the confrontation with Vernon, the decision to rebuild in this remote place, each step had only confirmed what she had begun to feel during those first days in Jackson's cabin. This was where she belonged, where they all belonged. As they drew closer, a figure emerged from the trees. Frank Sullivan come to welcome them and help with the unloading of supplies. About time you got back, he called cheerfully. We've got the foundation solid and the first floor joists laid. With your help, we might get the walls up before the first snow. Jackson guided the wagon to a stop and set the brake. Eager to get rid of us, Frank. Just eager to see this place rebuilt, the sheriff replied, helping Abigail down from the wagon. It's been too empty here since Catherine died. Eleanor climbed down, stretching after the long journey. The clearing looked different in summer, vibrant with wildflowers and the bright green of new growth. Nature had already begun to reclaim the scorched earth where the original cabin had stood, a reminder that renewal always followed destruction. As the men began unloading the wagon, Eleanor walked to the edge of the clearing where the trees opened to reveal a view of the valley below. The stream glinted in the sunlight, and beyond it, mountains rose in endless blue waves to the horizon. This wild, beautiful place had once been Jackson's refuge from the world, a solitary outpost where he nursed his grief and guilt. Now it would become something else, a home, a beginning, a place where three broken souls could heal together. Eleanor touched the short curls at the nape of her neck, remembering Vernon's cruelty, his attempt to mark her as worthless. Her hair was growing back just as Jackson had promised that first night. And she was growing too, becoming stronger, more certain of herself and her place in the world. "Mama," Abigail called from behind her. "Come see. Jackson says this room will be just for your piano." Eleanor turned smiling at her daughter's excitement. Beyond, Abigail Jackson stood watching them, his expression one of quiet contentment. Their eyes met across the clearing, and Eleanor felt again that certainty, that sense of rightness that had guided her through the darkest days. "Coming, sweetheart," she called back, moving toward them, toward home.